I mean, you expect economists to be experts on the economy, obviously. They're not. They're experts on a model of the economy. Mainstream economists do not have banks or debt or money in the macroeconomic models. They leave them out completely. If you leave banks and debt and money out of your model and you try to explain capitalism, it's rather like trying to explain birds and how they fly while ignoring that they have wings. That is so fucking ignorant. And people don't see it because all they see is the surface stuff about supply and demand. People think that describes the real world. It's completely mythical.
Who are you?
Professor Steve Keen.
Steve Keen is an economist and the author of Debunking Economics.
His work uses real-world data to show how private debt and credit drive financial crises.
So we have a dominant approach to economics which leaves out the fact that we wouldn't have an economy without energy, and that tries to pretend you can understand a capitalist economy without understanding the monetary system. And that is just stupid.
Today, Keen applies this same framework to climate change,
Arguing that global warming is not just an environmental problem, but the result of economic systems.
That economists have completely misled us about global warming and the catastrophic events that they don't even consider, but the scientists talk about. They're going to start happening, if we're unlucky, in the next decade. If we're lucky, it might take 20 years.
Okay. Wow.
We'll be lucky to get 8 years before we start to see truly serious damages. Politicians have taken the optimistic swing from economists without knowing that's what they've done. Politicians are completely in the dark over this. Go out and say you care about the climate, make speeches that make you look like you're a greenie, pander to that part of the electorate so they vote for you in the next election, but nothing serious is going to happen for the next 80 years. And so in that situation, politicians are going to be completely unprepared. They have no warning from the people that they most rely upon, which are their economic advisors, about the state we're going to be in.
We're in war in Europe. How does that affect us economically? How does affect Russia economically?
What it comes down to is we're trying to control different physical resources on the planet, as if there's not enough for everybody and we're going to secure our bit, get it at your expense. We're all on that same bloody little dot. We should not be destroying each other. To me, it's a sign of how primitive we are as a species, that we can even think that's a good idea. At the same time, I can't see a peaceful resolution over Ukraine. The ideological conflicts are so extreme. A large part of that's come from NATO, pushing itself forward and telling the Russians they wouldn't encroach upon the borders and then breaking their own promises and doing it. In other ways, I blame NATO and the Americans for the fact that we've got a war in Ukraine in the first place.
Who are you?
Who am I, or?
Yes, who are you? For everyone that doesn't know.
Okay, well, I'm Professor Steve Keen. I've been a professional economist for 30 years and a critic of economics for 50.
I'm 25 years old, so...
You lucky bastard.
So you've been an economist for more than my life.
Yeah, 3 times your age. It feels ridiculous, but you know, what you'll find as you get older, that you're a young man trapped in an old man's body. Like I used to do my sports when I was your age, included Olympic weightlifting, competitive tennis, and half marathons for running training and cycling.
Okay.
I was ridiculously fit. I weighed 52 kilos. I now weigh 82 kilos.
Okay.
And sport was just my life. I did academic stuff as well, of course, but I did a ludicrous amount of sport and didn't even think about it.
Are you doing still some sports?
All I can do now is weightlifting. I'm getting arthritis in my hands, so I can't hold a tennis racket anymore. My knees I've had 3 arthroscopes on my knees, so I've told you haven't got enough cartilage to go back to running again. So I can walk and I can weightlift.
Okay.
And that's what I do.
So I brought you here because I'm stupid economically.
That's an advantage, because most think they're bright economically have got screwy ideas in their heads, so you've got a good start.
So you are going to educate us with the audience about economics. Let's start from the beginning. What it means economics?
I'm going to start from a very weird position. And to me, economics should be trying to explain why humans live at a higher standard of living than the other animals on the planet.
Okay. Interesting perspective.
Right back there, because we tend to treat ourselves like we're independent of nature, garbage. We're part of nature. Okay? But we're part of nature that enjoys a larger amount of energy per member of our species than other animals do. So how do we achieve that? How do we go from living hunters and gatherers, living the same way all the other animals do on the planet, eating vegetables, eating other animals, staying alive that way? How do we go from that to intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the answer is we worked out a way to use energy. That's what we've fundamentally done. All the other animals on the planet can just use the energy coming in from the sun and stored in plants and stored in other animals and so on.
Oh.
Thank you.
Was
The
it the coffee
here?
that
Yeah, absolutely
we
vital.
but it's okay.
Thanks. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Okay. We also exploit fossil fuels. Okay? And that is what's given us the level of technology we've got now. And we have to explain how the hell do we get there?
I want to ask you about the energy. Explain a bit more about the energy. So what do you exactly mean?
Well, this is a recent advance that I've made in economics, which is ridiculous because it was first put forward by people in the 1700s. And that is that what enables us to live at the standard we do is what they used to call, this is the physiocrats back in the 1700s, called the free gift of nature. Now, we now know with physics of today, the free gift of nature is energy. We don't create energy. Okay? The amount of energy is a given. We exploit energy to turn physical things into goods and services for our consumption, and also energy so we can hop in a lift rather than walking up a mountain. So energy is the absolutely vital input, and we've managed to master energy. And that's what's given our standard of living. Whereas conventional economics, this particularly applies to the mainstream stuff that is called neoclassical economics. They model production as if you just put labour and capital together in a factory and goods will come out the other side. Garbage. The point that I came up with, and it's basically it codifies what was said back in the 1700s by the physiocrats, is that labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. So unless you've got energy as an input to both workers and machines, you won't get any output. So energy is absolutely vital, but it's left out of conventional economic theory. Then when you put it in there, what you get as well as that, if you're going to use energy to do useful work, you must create waste.
What you must create?
Waste. Okay. This is thermodynamics. If you want to use, what we're doing is exploiting energy that is a given in the universe, and we take it in its high intensity form, coal and stuff like that, coal, nuclear power, oil, et cetera, we use it to transform other products. And then we necessarily generate both physical waste in terms of slag and things like that, carbon dioxide as well, but also waste energy. So that's an absolute given law of the universe. So if you're going to produce output, you must generate waste. We're generating that waste back into the environment. We're damaging the environment. That undercuts our ability to exploit that energy in the first place. So that should have been the foundation for economics. And then you can find everybody else talks about Adam Smith as the father of economics. I regard him as the person who misled economics, not deliberately, not because he knew what he was doing, but the previous school of thought, which is called the physiocrats, basically said profit comes from the free gift of nature. We exploit the gift we find the energy, convert it into useful forms for ourselves. That's where profit comes from. Smith instead said profit comes from labour. Then we got involved in this huge argument between left-wingers, Karl Marx at one extreme, right-wingers, Marshall and co at the other. And we've been fighting over labour versus capital, but we're both ignoring the key thing. We have energy in the first instance. So that's my foundation. And then you look at what a capitalist economy is, because we used to exploit fossil fuels to some extent, things like peat and coal and things like that nature were used in feudal societies. Okay, but in a capitalist society, you've got to everything drives around money. So you've got to have a monetary system, and your monetary system enables you to then to buy the inputs, create the machinery, make the output that way. So you've got to understand the monetary system and energy. And ironically, mainstream economics understands neither. So we have a dominant approach to economics which leaves out the fact that we wouldn't have an economy without energy, and that it tries to pretend you can understand a capitalist economy without understanding the monetary system. And that is just stupid.
Okay, so I understand 70% of the stuff that you said.
We'll get
So
there.
let's-
How long do you talk? Is a long
It's a
podcast?
long podcast. So
We'll get there slowly.
we'll get there.
It leaves time for them to go to toilet breaks and stuff like that.
Yes. Whenever you want, we can do a toilet break.
Okay.
So, you said that we started using energy at 1700.
Mm-hmm.
So before that, we were still more advanced than so many animals.
But not a large degree. So if you look at this, taking energy is your foundation way of thinking about human civilization. You can see what we've done over time is basically us finding out ways to harness energy. So if you go back to hunter-gatherer societies, at that stage, we were, in a sense, hunting and like other animals, omnivores, but hunting like other animals did. The only advantage was we worked out how to make spears that we could, throw our energy a further distance and attack animals that way. Then we discovered domesticating animals. So with a domesticated animal, you can make a horse, take you riding somewhere. That's you exploiting the energy the horse has consumed to make it from point A to point B.
Interesting.
Then we discovered slavery. So what do you do in that case?
What a great discovery.
Oh, fantastic. We whack all these, just defeat all these people, rape and pillage the usual stuff that goes with it. And then they're forced to do what we want them to do with their energy. They've got the intelligence we can say, build that bridge, put those stones there, or we kill you. Okay. So that was slavery. Then we got to the feudal society, similar
and
sort
we
of.
were exploiting their energy.
Animal husbandry, slavery for humans and stuff like that. But if you take a look, there's a fascinating database that the Bank of England has done where they've gone right back to about 1000 AD and taken a look at the prices of standard commodities, wheat, barley, some fruit, et cetera, and worked out a consumption level for the average worker over that whole time period. And what you find is it's pretty much a flat line. There's ups and downs. Wages for workers went up after the Black Death because so many workers got killed by the disease that if you wanted to be a feudal lord, you had to pay your people more to hang on to them. So there was a rise after the Black Death and a fall, but no particular trend until 1700. And then in 1700, I think it was Newcomen, English inventor, who worked out how to make the first steam engine. We had windmills. The Dutch invented windmills. You had water wheels and things like that to take energy in that sense. But it was Newcomen, the first invention of the first viable steam engine. But that was extremely inefficient. And then what James Watt did, and everybody knows James Watt's name. Okay, still.
I don't, but forgive.
You don't? James Watt steam engine?
No.
Okay. Well, in the almost the same time the Wealth of Nations are written by Smith, an engineer in Scotland worked out that the reason that he could make the steam engines far more efficient if you had a separate condenser. Okay, so that when you had expansion, when the coal makes the gas expand and pushes the piston up, and then you've got to let it cool down again before you can actually do the same process again. The Newcomen engine did that in one cylinder. Watt put it in a second cylinder, so it was much more efficient. And that's when the real takeoff of civilization began, because then we were exploiting the energy of dead forests, dead animals, the oil, the coal, et cetera. That's when the real increase in living standards began. And it's fundamentally because we're getting exponential from that point on. And that's been, if you go back and look at...
and that proves that your theory is right, because energy is the fundamental.
That's what took us off, yeah. And like you find classic, conventional economists, like you heard of the name Jevons?
No.
Okay.
I told you I'm stupid. So
I'll interview you for a second. So what did you do for a living before you ended up in the European Parliament?
I was a YouTuber.
There you go. Well, I'm doing the same thing myself these days. So, yeah.
So continue.
But you did videos and
I was doing YouTube videos and I was in the army. I was traveling. This is my life. I don't have a big life before the European Parliament. I was elected when I was 24. So
yeah, that's an early start. Okay. Well, look, I've sort of forgotten why I asked that question, but what you have in economic theory is different schisms that have existed over time. So if you go back to the 1700s, the group of economists that I most like out of the whole history of economic thought are called physiocrats. And they were...
Physiocrats, a way to describe a theory.
Yeah, so each particular school of thought will have something they unify their ideas around. And the physiocrats developed at the same time that we were learning anatomy for the very beginning, because there were religious prohibitions on cutting up a body after death. And then they started to break down in the 1700s. So doctors started to do surgery and they found all these cables, It wasn't known we had, we could sort of see you've got veins up here, but seeing all the other nerve cables and stuff like that was a revelation in the 1700s. And what the physiocrats said is, well, the body has a circulation system. Blood circulates, air circulates, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, well, the same, when they had that analogy for the economy and saw the economy like a biological creature, okay, which is one very deep insight, because it is a circulation system. The second thing they did was, France was very, very agricultural, very little industry compared to Scotland, for example. And they, if you're trying to analyse how you produce output and you're looking at farming, it's fairly straightforward, because if you put one seed of corn in the soil, you'll get a plant with 1,000 seeds on it back. So you can see you input one seed, you get 1,000 seeds. Okay? How does that happen? Their explanation was, it's the free gift of nature. Okay? The sun, the land generate this fertility, and we just exploit it. Okay? We don't create the fertility. We might enhance it. We don't create it. We mainly keep other animals away from eating it. So we keep the insects and keep the rabbits away, and so we harvest that food. That very directly pointed out that it wasn't anything humans were doing that made that possible. So it had to be the free gift of nature. And that's the word energy was only invented in 1809. Okay?
1809. Wow.
Okay. So people are trying to explain this phenomenon we were discovering at this stage. So the physiocrats in the 1700s didn't even have a word for it. They called it the free gift of nature. It's basically saying we're exploiting energy. Okay? And if you have the gap between the amount of energy you need to put in to get something versus the energy you get back from that thing, then the gap is the surplus of energy output over energy input. And that surplus enabled you to buy the goods and services of the rest of society and so on, and create food, get manufacturing done, et cetera, et cetera. So they had this energy focus. There's a classic book written just before Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations by one of this school by a guy called Richard Cantillon. And it's written like 11 years before The Wealth of Nations. And we don't know whether Smith read it, because I don't think he refers to Cantillon by name in his writings. I could be wrong on that. There's some of Smith I haven't read. He doesn't in The Wealth of Nations, definitely. But he opens The Wealth of Nations by saying labour is the source from which all wealth flows. Okay? And the division of labour is what increases wealth. Well, Cantillon came out 11 years earlier and said land is the source from which all wealth flows. And labour reorganises that wealth but doesn't create it in the first instance. Now, Cantillon was right and Smith was wrong. Okay? So I think we went backwards from that school. And then by arguing that labour was a source of value, you then, if the industrial conditions for workers the living conditions for workers in Scotland when the whole thing began were dreadful. If you try to imagine what the life was like for workers in the late 1700s in Scotland and virtually England, think of Calcutta in the 1950s. Okay? Pollution everywhere, 14-hour days. You sleep next to the machine you're working on, quite a few cases. 1 day a week off for the Sabbath, that was it. Bloody awful conditions. Well, the workers started to revolt. Okay? And you equally had capitalists themselves, some of whom were socially progressive, who saw these conditions and said, this is a travesty. We should make life better for people. So, you know Cadbury's chocolates?
Yes.
Okay,
I do know that.
There you go. That began as a cooperative. Okay, Cadbury's was trying to build a form of socialist system to make up for the terrible situation of workers. There's many, many others, Roundtrees and a whole lot of philanthropic capitalists established what you might call a socialist system. So the idea that this wealth should be spread, you could see the incredible wealth of the industrialists who owned these factories and the dreadful conditions of the workers who worked in the factories. Then some people said we should really be sharing this better. So a socialist ideas about how we should organise society began in the late 1700s in Scotland. As the conditions got worse, that got stronger. You got Marx turning up. Marx began as a critic of the enclosure movements that were being done in the Black Forest to drive peasants out of the Black Forest so that the farmers, the capitalists could take over and take the output of the forests and profit from it rather than the peasants being able to do it. So Marx saw that and couldn't understand it from his point of view as the philosophy he'd learnt. So he decided to study economics, and he got evicted from Prussia. That's where he was born. A town called Trier. So he was evicted from Prussia. He went to France. He studied in France, he started reading the classical English economists, Smith and Ricardo and so on, and became a complete convert to their way of thinking. And they basically argued labour was the source of all value. So Marx effectively said, well, workers should get either all of or far more of the product than they're getting. And you then got Marxism developing as an attack on capitalism. Okay? And then that came to the head in 1871 when his book Capital was published. And at that stage, a totally different approach to economics took over, which is called neoclassical. Now, that's the approach that people learn today. And they have no idea of this history, most of them, but this is where it came from. And one of the leading characters is this guy called Jevons, I mentioned a while ago. Now, Jevons was a polymath. He was one of these people who specialised in a particular area but had a mind that could encompass a wide range of issues. So he developed all the ideas you see in textbooks today about marginal cost and marginal this and marginal that, what they call the marginal revolution. But he also understood energy. And he wrote a book called The Coal Question. And then he said, the very first word of that book was coal. Yeah? And he said, effectively saying energy, harnessing this energy is what's the real source of our growth of wealth. So he understood that, but his followers just took the marginal this and marginal that stuff and built a theory of production in which both labour and capital are necessary to produce output. Energy is forgotten. And they say, well, labour and capital both contribute. They both deserve to get a share. The workers get their marginal product of labour and the capitalists get the marginal product of capital. And so you don't need socialism because capitalism is a perfectly fair system a meritocracy, where you get paid what you deserve. If you contribute more, you get more. And so basically it was an anti-socialist argument to say that capitalism was already a utopia. Now that's bullshit. Okay, it is nonsense to see it that way. Capitalism has certainly dramatically increased the living standards of a huge number of people. We're seeing it in China now in a different form, but that revolution is enormous. And most of us, because we just live in the moment, in our own time, we don't see how much our lives have been transformed over time. So, for example, if you go back a century, certainly 1.5 centuries, even just a century, having a shower each day was the things that kings did. Okay? The average person didn't have hot water. Okay? Now, we just take it for granted. We get angry when the hot water doesn't work. Okay? We don't realise how much our living standards have risen over that period of time. But we develop theories about how it happened, and those theories get tied up in ideology. So you get Marxists at one extreme saying capitalists are exploiting workers, and we need a socialist revolution. And the other side, you get capitalists saying, we're already in utopia, what are you complaining about? So ideology dominates a huge amount.
Which is not right.
Not right. I mean, if your arguments come down to ideology rather than logic, then you're fundamentally wrong right at the very outset. If you don't have a logical foundation that makes sense for your arguments, you're basing it on an ideological opinion, which will at some point be proven wrong. And unfortunately, because, again, most people don't realise the ideological history of economics, they don't realise that the stuff they think is scientific. If you know the word neoclassical?
Yeah.
Okay. The people think that's economics. They think it's based on logic. But it began with an attempt to prove that capitalism was a utopia. Okay? Now, it's certainly a better society for most people than, say, feudalism was, in the sense that the feudal society was the same standard of living for the vast majority of people for 800 years. Okay? When you have the Industrial Revolution and the capitalism developing at the same time, then even though there's massive exploitation and pollution and all the usual horrors we know about, the average standard of living rose over that period of time. Colonialism played a role, obviously, too. Okay, but this capacity to raise the standard of living of the average person by increasing the amount of energy the average person gets to consume, that's something which is unique to capitalism. So there are arguments, okay, it's a better society, it's more dynamic, like the range of things we see around us, so the diversity of products we consume, that is also something that comes out of capitalism. So all these things are important to understand, but we've got a theory of economics dominating what people think is economics that ignores all that and just tries to prove that it's a meritocracy. And part of it, and there's parts of it which are completely unnecessary. There's no need for economic theory to turn out the way that it did in terms of trying to explain capitalism. But one part of it is they argue the money system doesn't matter. Now,
the money system,
the mainstream economics, the stuff that dominates economic policy here and all the parliaments around the world, mainstream economists do not have banks or debt or money in the macroeconomic models. Okay, they leave them out completely. Now, my attitude is if you leave banks and debt and money out of your model and you try to explain capitalism, it's rather like trying to explain birds and how they fly while ignoring that they have wings. It's just stupid. Okay? There was no necessity for that to be part of the theory. But that and many other what are fundamentally ideological assumptions have turned up in the theory, and people don't see it because all they see is the surface stuff about supply and demand. There's supply and demand curves and all that stuff. People think that describes the real world. It's completely mythical. All the so-called foundations explaining, why does the supply curve slope up? Why does the demand curve slope down? Why is all the action where the two lines intersect? It's mathematically wrong, the whole damn lot.
I still understood 70% of the stuff that you said. So I want later also to go back to the energy and like you said about that the land is what is important. But since you came here to describe this Marxist and capitalist and all this stuff, so I want you to explain what you think is the ideal scenario to organize better the resources and like what.
Well, this is the dangerous point is that I think we've got to a point where it's all going to fall apart. Okay, the idea that we can organise it better, we could have done that 50 years ago. Okay, but again, because of mainstream economists, we've ignored climate change until now. And it's starting to dawn on people now, I think, that, holy shit, those storms are really crazy, aren't they? You would have seen I think it was in Sicily, where the land just collapsed around a village, destroying a couple of hundred houses, just fell away. Floods in Spain, ice flowing down the streets in Spain in summer from crazy storms. The ice storm in the US right now, which is destroying large parts of the technology of the Midwest of America. Now we're saying, Jesus, this is real. Why have we ignored it? And the answer is because we listen to mainstream economists. So this is particularly a guy called William Nordhaus, who they gave a Nobel Prize to in economics for his work on climate change. He has trivialized the dangers we face from climate change, literally saying, in his first attempt to say, what's climate change going to do to the economy, saying that 3 degrees of global warming, we're currently at 1.5, 3 degrees of global warming by 2100 will reduce GDP in 2100 by 1/4 of 1%. compared to what would have been in the absence of global warming. Now,
by 1/4 of 1%?
1/4 of 1%, 1/400th, okay? You said if global warming, which is, you assumed it increased temperatures by 3 degrees by 2100, that versus a society where they had no global warming at all, our society is going to have an output of, say, 399. The one that stays at 0 degrees will have an output of 400. So if you think that tiny difference far in the future, extrapolated back towards now, what does it imply in terms of a fall in the rate of economic growth because of that global warming?
You think this number is correct?
It's bullshit.
Bullshit.
Absolute, total bullshit. Okay, he might have.
You
he
think
might
it's
as well
going to be huge?
Sorry?
You think it's going to be what?
Destruction, complete
So
and absolute destruction.
More than 50%.
100%.
Okay.
Okay, because.
Crazy to say, but we can talk.
And that's why we're talking about organising it better. I'm now talking about survival. Okay, that's what we need to worry about. The way Nordhaus reached that number was to first of all classify American, and there better backtrack. He was reacting to a report called Limits to Growth. Have you heard of that?
No.
Okay, you can get it online. Get your staff to download it and have a look at it. It was a study in 1972 done by engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And they're given a brief by an organisation called Club of Rome. Okay? But the Club of Rome just paid for the research. They didn't actually specify what to be done or how the research was being done. It was engineers at MIT that did the work. And they took the approach to economics that I take, which is what's called system dynamics, which talks about interrelations between different factors in a system generating the overall economy. So they had resources. You've got to have resources as inputs. Had pollution. If you do industrial production, you create pollution. Agriculture, and they had human health. They had five basic factors. And they worked very carefully with experts in those 5 fields to work out indices for each of them. So indices for population, resources, industrial output, agricultural output, and human health. And they then fitted those, the data into index numbers, and they ran the model from 1900 until 1970 so that it reproduced the numbers they had as inputs. So the model took the actual numbers we knew from 1900 to 1970 with index numbers, and then said, okay, we're going to make our model fit to it and then see what happens when we extrapolate it forward. So they did that, and what they call their standard run predicted the collapse of civilization would start in the middle of the 21st century. Yeah. Now, economists saw that and said, this is shit because we know capitalism can survive anything, so this must be wrong, so we're going to do our own version of it. And with absolutely no knowledge of the physical world, they went about making their own approach to estimating the impact of climate change over time. And these are people who, I mean, you expect economists to be experts on the economy, obviously. Okay? They're not. Okay? They're experts on a model of the economy.
Because of what you explained before. Because they are taking the wrong fundamentals.
Starting from a particular ideology and building a structure around that and so on, yeah. But they're complete amateurs on the climate. They have no idea of what climate actually means. But they thought 3 degrees increase in temperature, that's like moving New York, 1,000 miles south. That's all it's going to do. That's literally what they thought. So they said, because temperature change across the planet makes a very small impact to GDP, then temperature change over time will make a very small impact on GDP. Now, I'm writing a book which I wanted to finish last year and I haven't had a chance to finish it yet. Its working title is How Economists Will Destroy Capitalism. And what I wanted to explain is why the way that the economists have made up numbers about global warming is completely wrong. So just to go back to what Nordhaus actually did when he first tried to put numbers on what he thought global warming would do, he broke American industry down into 3 sectors. He said there's industry which is extremely exposed to climate, moderately exposed to climate, and negligibly affected by climate change. He put 3% of the economy in the seriously exposed, 10% in the moderately exposed, and 87% unaffected by global warming. And he assumed the industry will be unaffected by global warming, all of manufacturing, all of wholesale and retail services, all of the government sector, all of finance and real estate except for coastal real estate, and mining, and made up the 87% that way. And obviously, he's thinking you're only exposed to climate change if you're exposed to the weather. If your industry depends upon climatic variables, you'll be exposed. If it doesn't depend upon climatic variables, no problem. That is so fucking ignorant. Okay? I can use French in this.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So fucking ignorant, crazy. Okay? Because even with the mining, for example, even if he was right, well, there's underground mining, which is not exposed to the weather, and open cut mining, which is exposed to the weather. Somebody must have pointed that out to him sometime between 1991 and 1994, because the next paper he wrote said, he specifically said, underground mining is unaffected by global warming, by climate change, and he made a total of 85%. So he reduced his figure from 87 to 85% to reflect saying open cut mining will be affected, but not underground mining. That is completely ignorant of what climate actually means. And he said at one point, for the vast majority of the economy, manufacturing, services, it's hard to see any impact of the predicted changes over the next 50 to 75 years. Now, that shows he has no bloody idea that energy is needed for each of those sectors, okay? Even if with manufacturing, to say that manufacturing is unaffected by climate change implies that all the output in the world is made in an enclosed room, okay? That's bullshit. Factories, one factory needs the output of another factory. They all need the input of raw materials. You need roads that connect them. Roads are exposed to the weather, okay? He doesn't even include that. He literally says only water transport will be affected, and he ignores transportation. If you have factories, even if it was true that a roof is particularly from climate change, the roads are exposed. So the roads are going to get destroyed. And therefore you can't move goods from one factory to another. You can't produce output. It is that juvenile, that stupid an argument.
The roads will be destroyed in what exact way? I want you to
floods.
Want you to paint me the picture of what will...
Okay, well, floods, for example. And if you have a flood that wipes out roads, then therefore your factories are no longer connected. They're not connected again until you build a bridge over them. Or you've got to use helicopters rather than trucks to move goods between one point and another.
Or drones.
Huh?
Or drones.
Or drones, yeah. So it's just, it's ignorant. It's so stupid that you look at this paper and think, why on earth does it get published? And the only reason it got published is that it was refereed, as they call it, by other economists. And they're equally clueless about what climate means. So I've got a whole tradition of economists writing papers, predicting amounts of damage that global warming will do, which politicians take seriously without ever looking at how they came up with the numbers in the first place.
Yes.
When you take a look at it, it's an absolute crime. I believe these people, the economists who've done this stuff, deserve their own Nuremberg trial at some stage for negligence. They're not like the Nazis who wanted to kill large numbers of people. They're going to accidentally kill large numbers of people because we've taken the numbers seriously and they're complete and absolute bullshit. So that's the dilemma I think we face, and you're in the hot seat in that sense because being a member of parliament. We have to get people to realise this, and we have to start preparing for how do you survive as a society as you start to have your productive capabilities destroyed by climate change.
I want to ask you one question about this. I agree that climate change is a big problem, but as a person that I'm young, I see that there's a lot of technological advancement, artificial intelligence, all this stuff. I'm optimistic that we are going to build solutions about this. I want your answer about this.
Twofold. One, I think we're not going to get there fast enough. We're close. I mean, the horrifying thing is, are you a fan of Star Trek?
No, but I know the movie.
Okay. If any show like that, the dilemma is resolved in the last 30 seconds. Okay, they managed to work out how to disarm the Klingons, or the last 30 seconds. Thank God we just made it. You don't want that to be real life. Well, that's what we're in. It's a race between our technological capabilities, because we are getting to the point now where we can exploit solar energy, obviously. We've got nuclear becoming close to being revived.
Hopefully.
Molten salt reactors, modern water-cooled reactors do not melt down. So there's a range of improvements that mean we don't have the catastrophes we saw at Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and so on. So we're very, very close. And if we got past that, then we could survive, and then we'd be using solar energy and wind and nuclear, and we could phase out fossil fuels, and then we'd be able to get over this particular crisis. Okay? But we are so close. We're at 1.5 degrees of warming already. We can see the crazy weather this is already generating, and it's going to get exponentially worse in the next 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 of a degree increase in global temperatures. So that's what's happening on the negative side. On the positive side, the Chinese have just opened the world's first power generating molten salt reactor. They've got dozens of reactors in construction at one time. China's carbon dioxide output's actually falling.
Yes,
at the moment,
and it's in the forefront of green, of achieving the goals of no emissions, and by 2050.
Yeah, they're going to do it. Okay, the China will get there. The rest of the world is still in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry and trying to delay all this stuff. And you've got America trying to effectively using Ukraine to blackmail Europe to buy American energy American gas rather than Russian, and all this sort of stuff. But the only people who are doing it with anything like the alacrity we need are the Chinese. They may get
the
there.
Europeans are trying.
The Germans made the stupid mistake of shutting down the nuclear power stations 2 or 3 years ago. That's just ridiculous.
I agree.
There was no need to do that. This is ideology again. In this case, it's I won't call it green ideology. I might call it ideology of the Greens, but not green ideology. Political party being anti-nuclear, with not keeping up with what's happened in the last 40 years in terms of safety of that industry. So ideology got in the way. But even if we got over the energy hump, there's still one more we haven't solved yet, and that's biodiversity. Because we don't realise the extent to which we actually depend upon a vast array of species we don't even have names for, that are part of the food production system, bacteria, fungus, et cetera, all these things. And as we're dumping waste everywhere, we're starting to kill that system as well. Now, if we kept that up at some point, we'd get to the point where we've so significantly destroyed the biodiversity of the planet that we can't turn around. And the thing is, with energy, if we sort the energy issue out, yes, we can. Okay, energy is something we can solve because we can find alternative sources for energy to replace coal and oil, and therefore we stop pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that problem goes away. But if we continue destroying the ocean bed with the dredging we're doing to get minerals now, the pollution we're doing with agriculture, with fertilizer and pesticides and so on, the sheer pressure we're putting on the physical capabilities of the planet to produce food, that'll kill us.
So that's another danger, the biodiversity that we...
Yeah.
And this also comes from global warming.
Yeah, well, not so much global warming. It's just the fact that global warming is...
The emissions and all
the emissions and all the technologies. We were producing chemicals we call forever chemicals. We didn't make them so that they'd last forever, but they are. So there are chemicals we've created which are in the food chain and which are in our bodies, and they never degrade. The only way they're going to degrade is by tectonic plate movements finally taking them down into the molten magma, where that will break them down and they'll come back up again. So the Earth will get rid of them that way. But they're chemicals that no biological creature can process. So they simply accumulate and then they damage biological processes. So all this stuff is absolutely vital for us to understand. And we don't. Economists in particular have trivialized all this stuff. And so that's what I think that politicians simply aren't aware of just how catastrophic the situation is going to be in the very immediate future, because they're still lulled into a false sense of security by what the economists have written. And if you read the IPCC reports, The IPCC reports are thousands of pages long, dozens of chapters, and they come in 3 volumes. And when the politician tells their staff to go and read the IPCC report, what they're really saying is read the economic chapter in the IPCC report. Okay? So that's what they do. They read the IPCC economics chapter, and that's written by these same economists. So like with the 2022 IPCC report, a very big one, the economics chapter predicted that 4 degrees of warming by 2100 would reduce GDP in 2100 by between 10 and 23% compared to what it would have been in the complete absence of global warming. That's same sort of nonsense as Nordhaus was going on, but rather than saying 1/4%, they're saying 10 to 23%. Now, 10 to 23% sounds big, So you look at that and think, oh, that's a big change, but what does it work out in terms of a rate of economic growth? And this is the normal way economists talk is, X point Y% economic growth each year. That's how they'll argue. But what they're saying when they're doing those 10 to 23%, they're saying in 2100, if there was no global warming, output would be 100. Okay? With global warming of 4 degrees, it'll be 77 if you take the 23% gap. Okay? Then you take those two numbers and you say, well, we come right back to here, 2020, because roughly, that's 80 years in the future. What fall in the rate of economic growth is going to give you a 23% difference in 80 years? And the answer is a fall of the rate of economic growth of about 0.2 or 0.3% per annum. That's trivial. Okay? 0.2 or 0.3% higher or lower rate of economic growth would mean a slightly higher level of unemployment. Okay, but it's not catastrophe. It's still, slightly, you won't even notice type thing. If you get to 2100, if they were right, you wouldn't even know that there was any damage from global warming. It's just, we don't know now what the damage to our current GDP is from global warming, so you wouldn't understand it. That is so trivial. It's basically telling politicians, this is somebody else's problem. Go out and say you care about the climate, make speeches that make you look like you're a greenie, pander to that part of the electorates, they vote for you in the next election, but nothing serious is going to happen for the next 80 years, okay? We'll be lucky to get 8 years before we start to see truly serious damages. And so in that situation, politicians are going to be completely unprepared. They have no warning from the people that they most rely upon, which they're economic advisors, about the state we're going to be in. So what I'm trying to do, and you can tell it's a major focus of my career now, is to warn that economists have completely misled us about global warming and the catastrophic events that they don't even consider, but the scientists talk about. They're going to start happening, if we're unlucky, in the next decade. If we're lucky, it might take 20 years. But I don't think we've got, and in fact, I've worked with a lot of climate scientists now, and I saw one of them, a guy called Tim Lenton, and Tim is the professor of climate change at Exeter University in the UK, and he was asked at a meeting, I saw it on YouTube, as a conference, what do you think is going to be, will human civilization last to 2100 if we continue on the current trajectory? Now, Tim's answer was not a chance. Absolutely not a chance. So when you talk to climate scientists, some of them, will side with the economists, very few. A lot of them, some of them will be more confident about being able to get over the hump. So a guy called Michael Mann, have you heard his name? Michael he's a leading American climate scientist that he thinks will make it. Okay, so he's optimistic and he pushes that line. But I'd say at least half of them, I'm guessing from my own interaction with climate scientists, at least half of them think we won't make it as a civilization.
We might make it.
So,
we might make it.
A nightmare, a complete nightmare. So this is, and because politicians have taken the optimistic swing from economists without knowing that's what they've done, politicians are completely in the dark over this.
Okay. I want to go back to all the other stuff that we're talking about the economy, but to close this chapter about climate change, I want you to tell me also what we should do.
what we have to do is ration, get ready to ration. We need to have food buffers because there's going to be collapse in food output. That'll be one of the most...
Food buffers, meaning?
Meaning warehouses that store food in case there's a collapse in the food supply. Okay? If, like one of the scariest prospects for climate change is what's called the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. You've heard of that?
No, that's a very complicated term for me.
It actually has a wonderful acronym, the AMOC. Okay. So we go amok. The Atlantic, there are oceans, there are currents in the ocean caused by temperature variations and there's rotation of the Earth and so on, which circulate water from all the Earth's oceans. Okay? Very slowly, nothing like as fast as a river moving, but there's one which goes from the Antarctic to the Arctic through the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans and Indian Oceans and so on. And the part of it that is in the Atlantic Ocean is called the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. And what it talks about is there's more heat in the southern hemisphere than there is in the northern hemisphere. So this ocean current takes that heat, hot water, and it goes close to the surface from the south of the Atlantic across the equator up to Europe, and then it gets much saltier because of evaporation. And salty water is heavier than fresh water, so it's lost its heat, and cold water is more dense before ice starts to form than warm water, so it sinks, and then it comes back on the bottom of the Atlantic and comes back down and joins up, and the circulation continues. Now, the scale of that current is something which is unimaginable for human minds. So a guy called Savert was the expert who started looking at this particular current, and they've named the unit of measurement that they use a sievert. And what a sievert is the amount of water that would move through a 1 kilometre square in 1 second. So you imagine having a 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre square, and you have water moving through it that's a movement of 1 kilometre of water, 1 metre in 1 second is a sievert. I probably made a couple of mistakes there, so scientists will criticise me on it, but that's the basic idea. So your measurement is like a pipe 1.3 kilometres in diameter with water moving through it, okay? The total flow of all the rivers on the planet is 1.5 sieverts. Okay? The Atlantic meridional circulation is 15 sieverts. So at 10 times the amount of water that and that water is hot in the Southern Ocean, warm in the Northern Ocean. If that, then it has turned off at various times in history because of natural climate change. If it does, the average temperature in Europe will fall by 10 degrees.
How so? Because
there no longer the heat transfer won't occur. At the moment, the heat transfer goes from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere and back down again. If that cuts off, that warmth from the southern hemisphere, which warms Europe, will no longer be there. And the average temperature, it's complicated, but roughly speaking, will fall by about 10 degrees. Now that means Europe, which is already cold, will be uninhabitable. The northern regions will start turning into glaciers. That'll be an impact of global warming. Okay, now people don't realise that global warming just doesn't mean the whole place gets hotter. It's much more volatility in temperature, and what places that are hot and places that are cold change. But if that happens, Europe becomes uninhabitable. Now, the first studies of that current were done in the late 1990s, and by 2008, they thought roughly 3 degrees of warming would be necessary to cause that to flip. The latest studies say 1.1 degrees is enough. We're already at 1.5. And the prediction of scientists is that sometime between 2025 and 2095, they claim that it's virtually certain that the current will shut down. Now, if it does, a study done by the OECD, which Tim Lenton wrote in 2021, said that if that happens, so we have 2.5 degrees of warming and AMOC shuts down, the area of land on the planet that can support wheat and corn will fall by 70%. Now, if you find a 70% fall in the amount of food being produced, that's a global famine which will kill half the population of the planet. And the way it's going to happen, it won't be a gradual thing. It'll be something like a drought that wipes out the Russian and Ukraine and American wheat crops all at once, or a series of floods, all sorts of ways you can destroy with the changed climate. But when it happens, it means suddenly you won't have food. Now, the only way to survive that is to have warehouses ready for it. So
warehouses to produce food.
To store food.
To store.
You literally, this is one thing I'm pushing for a number of political parties. If you have the warehouses, they can mean that if you have a collapse in the crop, you have 3 months worth of food, so you can survive to the next harvest. Okay, but without that, if you have this, if the collapse happens and you haven't got a food buffer, then half your population is going to die.
Interesting.
That's the sort of thing we stand for. So I want to see, because we haven't prepared, because we haven't modified our behaviour for the last half century, we're now going to be caught by surprise by it. So unless we have buffers, we're in serious trouble.
Now you said a solution if this happens, but it's a good solution to take measures to have food if for any case. But what's some other things that we can do in the economy? Like, for example, speed up the solar energy.
We have to speed up solar. Yeah, speed up solar, approve nuclear. Learn what the Chinese are doing in terms of the molten salt reactors. The water-cooled ones are now safe as well. But update the regulations, because the regulation we have over nuclear are as if we're still producing Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island style nuclear reactors. We're not. We're producing nuclear reactors that's safe to literally stand next to. So the safety focus we have is for a technology which is 40 years out of date. So in that sense, if we free up the technology, enable nuclear power stations to be built. The other problem we've got water cooled is itself an issue, because like France had to shut down its nuclear power stations a couple of years ago because the drought got so bad, they no longer had water coming in that they could cool the towers with, so they had to shut them down. And you can't use salt water for that because it's too corrosive. So there's all these sorts of issues, and that's why, to some extent, the molten salt reactors are more likely a long-term viable solution. Or you have to have systems which are, doing osmosis or desalination to use ocean water to cool them. All these things are seriously important issues we need to work out, but rapidly enable us to expand nuclear, solar rapid expansion as well. There are issues over whether we have enough minerals to support that, because again, to make solar panels and make windmills and make nuclear power stations, you've got to have physical inputs. We don't even have enough copper. All these issues of shortages of essential minerals are becoming real. We have to be aware of that. You want to get engineers and chemists involved to tell you what are your physical needs and do you have the system to enable it. So start preparing for massive change in the energy system. Food buffers, so if you do have a food collapse, you can survive rather than falling apart as you would if you had a total famine. And bring out systems for rationing. Because if you have a society where only the rich can eat the food, then the poor will eat the rich. So if you're going to you have to have systems that means regardless of your social status, you don't starve to death. Okay? If you don't have that, your societies are going to fall apart. So I think all this stuff is absolutely vital to realize just how close we are to catastrophe, and we have to prepare in a sort of a World War style approach to be ready when the catastrophe hits.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Lot to take in. Okay. So I think we are closing the chapter of this. So let's go back to the crazy cool idea that everything is land and energy. So that means that the bigger countries have an advantage to become more rich. with your...
Not really. It's when they said land, they really meant energy. So countries with their energy sources, that's why the incredible wealth of the Saudi Arabia area. It's all because that's where the oil happens to be. Now, if we realise we simply can't allow temperatures to rise any further, then we probably would get a outright ban on using oil is feasible. Okay? If you do that, then you have to have other transportation systems in a hurry. So you have to have non-oil-based transportation. Electric, but even like electric cars, trains are a better idea. What the Chinese have done on the train system they've got in China means you can get over the entire, it's the size of the European continent, and you can get virtually everywhere by high-speed rail. That means you don't need individual cars. You don't need the energy consumption and the pollution that comes out of them. Make that an absolute priority. Europe has to catch up on that front with China. So it's mainly the days of freely using fossil fuel energy are over, and they should have been over 50 years ago. We're delaying it by 50 years. That's why we face such a serious challenge right now.
Okay, so it doesn't matter if a country is big or small. It matters how you use your
big
energy.
or small makes a bit of a difference because it's the scale of industry you can undertake. So, there are so many, like a small country.
I'm from Cyprus. Only 1 million population.
Yeah. You can't have a car factory in Cyprus. You can't make your own cars. You might be able to make bicycles, electrically powered bicycles, and you can innovate into a market economy and that sort of thing. But it's too small to be viable on its own right. It's got to cooperate with other countries. So the idea of European cooperation, I think, is a good one, but it's been handled badly. And all the European Union has been organised around the ludicrous objective of minimising government debt. That's been the organising principle for it, and that's a mistake.
Why so?
Because government debt's not the problem. And this is the other side of economics. This might be a change of topic. I'm going to depress the hell out of you out of the climate change material. But economists also don't understand the monetary system. So they've convinced politicians that government debt is a bad thing because the government borrowing takes money away from the private sector. That's the mentality they have.
And government borrowing, you think is a good thing?
Government doesn't borrow in the first place.
Okay.
This is the other irony because you'd expect economists to be experts on money. Okay? But to understand money, you've got to understand double entry bookkeeping, which is accounting. Okay. And most economists don't.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the way that a bank creates money is it has assets, which are mainly the debt that it creates when it loans money. That's an asset of the bank. It's a liability of the borrower. Okay. They have liabilities, which are deposit accounts. And you and I, everybody, transacts and buys things through our bank accounts. So the total supply of money is fundamentally the total liabilities of the banking sector to the non-banking sector. That's where money comes from. Now, neoclassical economists sort of understand that, but they pretend that banks don't actually lend money. The theory they teach students is that banks, what they call intermediaries. So they say banks are just agencies that are better at evaluating who should and shouldn't get a debt. But what they do is they enable savers to lend to borrowers. So the idea they have is that some people are frugal and responsible and, they don't drink lots of coffee and they have frugal lives and they
lots of coffee.
save large amounts of money and they lend it to the absolute coffee addicts and therefore there's savers and borrowers and that's what the banks do. That's complete and absolute bullshit. Okay? Banks create money. They don't channel somebody's existing money. They
How
create
so?
it. Okay? Because using double entry bookkeeping, and that's what banks are fundamentally accounting entities. Okay. So they've got to make sure their assets must exceed their liabilities. Otherwise, that is bankruptcy for a bank is where their liabilities are greater than their assets. Okay. So they give you a loan. So they say, if that's a nice place in Belgium you want to buy, here's €1 million to buy it. And by the way, you owe us €1 million. So when they lend you money, they put that money in your deposit account and they put a matching amount, the amount of debt that you owe them. That's double entry. Now, when you put that together, you realise, first of all, banks matter because banks create spending power. So you've got to have banks in your macroeconomics. That's completely ignored by the neoclassicals. What they argue is
banks is a very crucial thing for the growth of the economy.
Yeah, for the functioning of the economy. If you don't have banks and debt and money in your macroeconomic model, you don't have a macroeconomic model. You've got a myth. But that's what economists teach. So they call them dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models. It's a big mouthful. In my opinion, they're neither dynamic nor general. They're models that assume the economy reaches equilibrium.
So you agree with this famous video of Ray Dalio, how he explains
Ray's he's in a reasonable, I mean, he's made fortune out of it. So, he's got a track record to prove it for him. He's got the same credit-driven approach that I have, but funnily enough, he still accepts the textbook argument that banks don't lend money. He accepts that banks enable savers to lend to borrowers. So he doesn't actually track the aggregate level of private debt. And what I say is that banks create money. So it's not, when they create money, they create spending power. And so a large part of the change in GDP each year comes out of the change in debt every year. So but you can get so much private debt accumulated that, first of all, people no longer want to borrow. So the willingness to borrow declines as you get a higher and higher level of private debt. And then when people stop borrowing, the demand that's based on spending newly created money disappears. So if you look at the global financial crisis, and I'm one of the handful of economists who warned of it before it happened, what you find is, let's take the American data, American private debt in 1945 was about 50% of GDP. By 2007, it was 170%, so 3.5 times as much debt. And the change in debt each year never went negative, so it's always a positive change until 2007. And then in 2007, the increase in debt that year, credit, was equivalent to 15% of GDP. Then the subprime bubble burst. Nobody wanted to borrow money to buy houses anymore, so that demand evaporated. House prices are falling. People are liquidating their houses to try to pay their debt. Debt actually fell, and you went from credit being 15% of GDP in 2006 to minus 5% in 2009. So a 20% turnaround. That's what caused the global financial crisis. Now, neoclassicals still have no idea that that's what actually happened. They record the data, but they don't look at it because according to their model, credit is a transfer of spending power. So if savers lend to borrowers in their model, savers can spend less, borrowers can spend more. If borrowers repay their debt, borrowers can spend less, savers can spend more. It sort of evens out. That's garbage. Okay, that's like saying no money gets destroyed by people paying off debt. But when you see that credit comes from banks creating money, then that creating money increases demand, and if there's negative, it decreases demand. So you
saw that will decrease demand, and that's why you predicted.
That's right. I saw that because I saw the level of the private debt. I did my PhD modelling what's called Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. You heard of Minsky?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did hear of Minsky. W. Nothing. In our generation, we say W when it's a win. We say W when it's a win. I know Minsky, so a win. It's a Slack that we use.
No, it's M, not W. Minsky.
Oh, W is a win, because a win for me that I knew Minsky. So I made a joke.
Oh, okay. So pardon me, I got it wrong.
We have some age difference in jokes.
Shit, yeah. Well, you got to teach me some young jokes before I get too old to pick them up. But anyway, okay, they're going to joke. You got me flummoxed. That's one to you. But so I modelled his thesis, and Minsky, he was an interesting character. He's the son of two refugees from Stalin. Okay, so when Stalin came to power in Russia, And you had what's called the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks, their particular faction of Marxists, they led the revolution. And the Bolsheviks argued that you can jump from feudalism to socialism. You didn't need to pass through capitalism. So they thought they could centrally plan their way from being a peasant feudal society, which is what Russia was until 1917. They could transform it to an industrial society, socialist, without passing through a capitalist phase. There's other Marxists, a group called Mensheviks, and they said, no, you've got to go through the capitalist phase. So if we have a revolution to overthrow the Tsar, we have to have a capitalist period, after which we can go to socialism. Now, the Mensheviks, the main enemy that the Bolsheviks saw themselves having were the Mensheviks. So if you were a Menshevik in Russia when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred, you got the fuck out of there, otherwise you're going to get assassinated. So Minsky's parents moved from Belarus to Chicago, and he was born in Chicago in about 1919. So he was 10 years old when the stock market crash occurred in 1929, and his parents were Marxists. So his perspective was, he saw how bad the Great Depression was, like a teenager from 29. He was a teenager in 32. And by 32, the unemployment rate in America had risen from 0 in 1929 to 25%. Soup kitchens everywhere, horrific situations, the panic everybody had, this is going to go on forever. So that's his formative experience as a 13-year-old. He's seeing all that around him with Marxist parents. And so his question when he became an academic, and he became an academic in the late 40s, early 50s, was what caused the Great Depression? So the question he asked himself was, can it, where it is a Great Depression, happen again? And if it can happen, why hadn't it happened between 1945 and 1982? And he developed this hypothesis he called the financial instability hypothesis. But his attempt to mathematically model it failed. So I decided I'd do that as part of my PhD. And I built a model that generated an accelerating level of private debt leading to a crash. So that was what I did back in 1992. I built that model. Then, for various reasons, my academic career, a book I wrote called Debunking Economics that caused a huge fight with neoclassical economists over something completely different. I took my eye off that data for a while. And then in 2005, I got asked to be an expert witness in a court case over predatory lending in Australia. And I took a look at the data again, and I just was horrified to see that the ratio of private debt to GDP was rising exponentially. Not the level of debt, the ratio of debt to GDP. And I thought, this can't go on forever. When it stops, credit will turn negative, and that'll cause the biggest crisis since the Great Depression. So that's what I argued at that stage. Now, what conventional economists will tell you is private debt doesn't matter. They say private debt is something, it's a bit like worrying about sex, okay? And private debt is like sex, okay? Whatever couples do in their own bedroom and whatever the couples are, that's their problem. It doesn't affect anybody else. That's why they teach you about private debt. Government debt, they claim that governments borrow from what they call the market for loanable funds. And they'll say there's a certain amount of money that exists. So if the government runs a deficit, they take some of that money away, and that reduces the amount of money available for the private sector, and that will cause unemployment and a crisis. So the attitude of the people who founded the euro and American politicians.
So they're thinking a zero-sum game.
Yeah, they think that what they think is there's a certain amount of money available to be borrowed, and if the government runs a deficit, then it has to borrow some of that money, which means the private sector has less.
And why this is not correct?
Because, in fact, when the government runs a deficit, it actually creates money. Okay? The government spending more than it takes back in taxation and then issuing bonds, okay, actually creates money. It doesn't take money away. It's the opposite of what the neoclassicals think. And you can only see it using double and triple
tipping. They create bonds, so they have revenue to...
The bonds are independent. This is all stuff I've done in my Ravel software. I've invented a software package called Ravel. One of its functions is to show how the banking sector operates. And when you put all this stuff together in double entry bookkeeping, you see that the government actually creates money when it runs a deficit. So there's two fundamental types of money. There's money created by banks and money created by governments. Now, banks, to create money, they've got to create debt. Okay? So when a bank gives you a loan, it says, here's €1 million to buy that house, and you owe us €1 million. So debt creates money for the private sector. But in the government's case, and it's easy to think about when you work in terms of taxation and think about what taxation does, and then add government spending. And of course, government spending is going to do the opposite of what government taxation does. Okay? So the government taxes you, then what happens is your bank account goes down. Okay? If your bank account goes down, you don't get any, just the tax alone reduces the amount of money you've got, that reduces your net worth. Okay? So taxation is a negative for your financial net worth. At the level of the bank, when the government takes the money out of your account, it does it by taking it through reserves. So deposit accounts fall and reserves fall. That's the balancing item for the private banks. At the central bank, reserves are a liability of the central bank. And the reason the reserves fall is because the government account is increasing. So at the central bank, that fall in reserves is because money that's been taken out of your account is being paid into the government's account. So reserves go down and government account goes up. And then at the government level, because the government's got tax revenue from you with no offsetting thing at all, the government's net worth increases. So taxation reduces the net worth of the private sector and increases the net worth of the government. Okay? And that's fairly...
So you're basically saying that they don't have a big correlation, the banks, with the government?
Well, I'll just finish the tale about spending, because spending is the opposite. So the government spends, it puts money in your bank account. Okay? It puts that money, your deposit account rises, the reserves rise. The reserves rise because there's funds transferred from the government's account at the central bank to the private bank's accounts at the central bank. And then at the level of the government, that spending means the government goes into negative equity. If it spends more than it gets back in taxation, the government's net worth in financial terms is falling. Now, that means at your level, at the level of ordinary people, our net worth is rising. So a government deficit actually creates money. Okay? And then the whole bond...
So it's a good thing.
It's a good thing
to have a government
that does it, because that's how...
At what extent?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's a question of how far does it go. So like the banks create credit-backed money. To create money, the banks must create debt, which means they're changing the level of debt, and that's called credit. But the government creates money by spending more than it gets back in taxation. So rather than a deficit being a bug of the feature, it's actually a bug of the system, which you want to get rid of. It's a feature. If you don't have a deficit, you don't create fiat-backed money. So right from the very outset, the whole obsession about reducing government debt is not understanding how the government creates money in the first place. And then we look at when the bonds are sold, this is more for a country other than Europe because of the stupidity of having a single currency for the whole continent.
It is stupid?
It's stupid, yeah. You can remedy the mistake, but it's a mistake. It was always a mistake. Okay? But if you look in America, for example, like the American... Yeah, I know.
So many things that we need to talk about.
Lots of stuff. But like the American government, when it spends more than it takes back in taxation, and it's done that from 1900 to 2025, the number of years that America's run a surplus, so tax more than it spends, is about 12 years, 15 years out of 125. Where it's actually run a surplus. Most of the time it's run a deficit of about 2.5%, 3% of GDP. That's the average over that time. That's how it creates money, okay? So it's not, if you don't have the government running a deficit, then you don't have fiat-backed money being created. All the money you've got left is created by the banking system. It's credit-based money. And that is actually, if in terms of a balanced system, a capitalist system, you want both credit-backed money and fiat-backed money. It's a question of how much of both and what's the balance and what's the total amount and all these sorts of questions. But you've got to create the fiat-backed money in the first place. And you don't create it unless you run a deficit. So the whole obsession that the Maastricht Treaty puts us in, no more than a 3% of GDP deficit. That's an unnecessary constraint on one half of the system.
So how much it should be?
Oh, the Chinese are currently running a deficit of 10% of GDP. Okay, it's a question of what you do with the deficit. So if you use the deficit to bomb the shit out of Ukraine, you know.
Yeah, okay. You're right.
If you build the deficit to build,
if you are using it to fuel the economy.
Yeah, high speed. Have you been to China?
Yes.
When did you go? Just very recently, obviously.
Like 3 years, 2 years ago.
You saw the infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing. I mean, last time I was there was 2017. I really want to go back and see it again now because China's rate of economic growth is about, in per capita terms, has been averaging about 8% per year. Well, that means less than every 10 years, this per capita standard of living doubles in China. So if you had 40 years where they're doing that, it means they double, 4, 8, 16 times.
So they are using this deficit the high deficit
infrastructure.
To build the infrastructure to influence the economy. Yeah. And this worked.
It works because that then means.
So you think 10% is okay? Maybe 20%?
No. You don't want to. I mean, 10% is pushing it.
It's pushing.
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
But if you look at the certainly, I think a 3% deficit rather than being a maximum should be a minimum.
Should be a minimum. Interesting. Yeah. But can we come to the euro?
Sorry?
To the euro.
Well, the euro is a real complication. Dirk Bessemer, the guy I mentioned earlier to you, have a chat to Dirk because he knows more about the euro than anybody, including me. Okay, so Dirk's actually based here in the European Parliament. But what he showed to me, and I didn't know this until we built a model of it in my software, is that the European Central Bank isn't actually involved in money creation at all. Okay?
Yeah. It's just going up and down.
They handle the trade imbalances. The main thing that they keep track of is the trade imbalances between different European countries. They can buy bonds. They do a lot of that. But in terms of the money creation, that's actually done by the national treasuries. So the French Treasury and the French Central Bank, between them, create euro in France. And the Bundesbank and the German Parliament create euro there. The Cyprus, similar. The money creation occurs in Cyprus, but it creates exactly the same currency that's used for the other 20 countries. So if you get a trade imbalance, and like the classic that this is applied to is actually Italy, because Italy, in terms of industrial development, Italy was on a par with Germany in terms of the quality of its industrial capability. Mercedes up in Germany and Lamborghinis in Italy, you've got similar technological scale. But Italy's always had a higher inflation rate than Germany. Now, in the past, what that would mean is the price of Italian cars in lira would increase over time, but then the Italian lira would decrease in value. So it was cheap for a German to buy an Italian car, expensive for an Italian to buy a German car. So Lamborghini had its market and could survive. When you lock them into one currency, that inflation disappears. Okay, so German cars get cheaper.
Do you think that's why we're seeing a rise of prices and people cannot afford the?
It's a large part of it. Why? Yeah, I mean,
because it cannot devalue itself. The currency,
the currency itself massively complicates the situation. And like, if you go back and take a look at when the Maastricht Treaty was being drafted, it had critics from opposing ends of economics both saying it's not going to work. You had Milton Friedman, who's a right wing.
Yes, I know him.
Yeah, a bit of a jerk. Okay, actually, and he.
You like him or no?
No, I don't like him. He's a fool. Unfortunately,
no, his personality, but his ideas.
His ideas are foolish.
Okay,
I don't mind. I mind his personality less than I mind his ideas.
Okay,
he was destructive on that front. He's a funny bloke. We should never have taken him seriously. But he argued against the euro, saying, "Look, the American dollar works across the whole of America because we all speak the same language, or they all bastardise the same language. We have a big national government and small states, relatively speaking." It's a relatively homogenous society. Right? And like even in terms of geographically, there's one huge mountain range on one extreme. You've got the Rockies and you've got the Appalachians. In the middle, it's fairly flat, so it's a huge open plain. All that stuff worked really well for America as a country in which to build an industrial system. Europe, you've got mountain ranges everywhere. You all speak different languages. You've had decades, centuries of bashing each other up. The most warlike continent on the planet, when you look at it, before the Americans turned up, was Europe. Okay? America's the most warlike empire in history, but European as a continent, far more wars in Europe than wars in Asia. We caused half the wars in Europe. Asia had its wars, but it settled down with the Chinese dynasty dominating the whole region, and you had much more political and military stability in Asia than you had in Europe. So you're bashing the shit out of each other all the time. You speak different languages. You've got national rivalries, all that sort of stuff, and you want to become the United States of Europe. Friedman said it's not going to work. That's his attitude. The other extreme is a guy called Wynne Godley. And give an idea of what I think of Wynne Godley. Part of my software is named after him. I use what are called Godley tables to show double entry bookkeeping. So Wynne is a brilliant man and understands systems far better than Friedman. He said the Maastricht Treaty is not going to work. And his reason for it was what I mentioned about differential exchange rates, meaning you can handle differential rates of inflation. You throw that away. And then the whole idea that you're going to limit government spending means that when a downturn occurs in the private sector, the European governments will be unable to respond. So a large part of Wynne's argument was, and this is mine as well, that the government spending acts like a stabiliser on the private sector. So if you have a serious slump like 2007, you have a fall in credit-based demand from plus 15% to minus 5%, okay? But the government deficit rose by a factor of 3. So the deficit went from 0 to 12%, roughly 0. So the increase in government deficit counteracted the severity of the private sector downturn, and we had a serious recession. We didn't have a depression. You go back to the 1920s. In the 1920s, you had the same obsession about reducing the level of government debt. So the American president in the 1920s was a guy called Calvin Coolidge, and every year he ran a 1% of GDP surplus. So he taxed 1% more than he spent. And he saw that as being extremely responsible. He said the surplus is what caused the boom of the 1920s. He wasn't even looking at the data, which obviously I've done, that showed us he was reducing government debt from 30% of GDP to 15% over the 1920s. The private sector increased the debt level from 80% to 140% across the same time period. So he was reducing government spending by 1% of GDP every year, while the private sector was increasing spending by 5%. That's why you had a boom in the 1920s. But the debt level goes through the roof. You had the huge stock market bubble in the 1920s. It all came crashing down. And one day in October in 1929, 10% fall in the stock market. That wiped out huge numbers of people, wiped out the banks. And so you had a serious private sector downturn, but the government was trivial in size. So the government had been, like the government before the Great Depression and the Second World War, the average size of the American government as a percentage of its GDP was about 3%. So total government spending, 3% of GDP. There was no income tax, so you didn't have a fall in government revenue when there's a slump. There was no welfare. You didn't have unemployment benefits and all this sort of stuff. So there was no compensating increase in government spending until the New Deal. Now, the New Deal, which is Roosevelt's proposals of government spending, that led to a deficit of 5% of GDP. Okay, the deficit we got during the global financial crisis was 12 to 15%. So the scale of the government response is bigger now than it was back then. So the whole obsession with reducing government debt is simply wrong. And that obsession is what defines the euro, which is one reason the euro functions so badly.
Okay, so do you think, like, for example, my country, Cyprus, should leave the euro? Because the tricky situation now that we are in the euro and going back and like how it will work.
I would prefer if you stuck with your own currency. If I had to think about the whole idea of having a single monetary system for the whole of Europe in its own right is not a bad idea. Okay? Because if you behaved as a country rather than warring states, as you do at the moment, then people wouldn't mind that Greece was getting more money because it needs to get its industry developed further. There'd be an agreement about spreading all these resources. Like Californians don't think about their deficit funding Alabama.
Yeah.
But it does, So if that level of agreement, you'd be okay. But without it, you have this, Germans complaining about Greeks getting more and all this sort of conflict that generates domestically. So would there have been a way to be able to hang on to varying exchange rates? So if Italy has a higher rate of inflation than Germany, you can compensate. Yeah, you hang on to national currencies. But the hassle about national currencies, and you'd know this traveling around Europe yourself, everywhere you go, use euro. Really convenient. Okay? You don't need to exchange your money. Back in the days of the lira and the mark and so on, you had to exchange your money and you lost. You'd be paying it to American Express or whoever, and they'd take 10% each time. So you hated it. Okay? What I would rather have seen is, say, the central bank saying, we're going to handle the exchange rate variations and we're going to give you 100%. So the central banks will wear the loss of the currency conversion, which would be much smaller if they were doing it than if the private sector was doing it. And that way you could have your lira in Italy, you fly to Berlin, hop out the plane, you do an electronic transfer, you get exactly the equivalent in marks that you had in lira, no loss, and it's easy. That's what we should have designed. And that we could still go back to that. And then the euro could be used for international trade, but use national currencies for intra-European. But I know, the odds of that are almost zero.
Yes.
Politically. So the best thing to think about is saying, get rid of the Maastricht Treaty limitation, abolish that 3% and 60% rule, which virtually no country achieves anyway. And the reason they don't achieve it is it's a stupid objective. And so if you're trying to do something impossible and stupid, you're unlikely to achieve it, despite how strongly you write those principles down.
Okay, so another thing that I want to talk about is, in my country, Cyprus, I started a political party right now.
Sorry?
In my country, Cyprus, I started a political party recently. It's been 3 months. The name is Direct Democracy. And now we are shaping the policies of our economic policies and stuff. So one of the priorities of the people that they want this party, they are followers of this party, is that it's too expensive, everything, to pay rent. So what is some policies that we should make to drop, to fix the problem of the people?
Yeah, I mean, one of the huge hassles about the neoliberal period was they basically let the banks do what they damn well liked. And what the banks have done, the reason you can defend private money creation is that you would trust a private institution to make a better estimate of whether something is a good or a bad investment than a bureaucrat. That's the basic logic. But banks can lend for productive investments, or they can lend for speculation on asset prices. And by far they're focused more on speculating for asset prices than they have for industrial development loans of that nature. So the banks actually think it's risky to lend to the physical economy. It's safer for them, they think, to lend for somebody who wants to buy a house because they expect the house price to rise. So what you've had is this bubble in money for buying housing. So mortgage debt has increased by a factor of 3 or 4. And that's actually what's driven up house prices. So I'd bring in regulations to limit the amount that banks can lend against housing to some multiple of the income earning potential of the house. Because at the moment, they've got this bullshit line that we've got to go back to the beginning of the house price bubble, because like for most countries, the house price bubble began in the 1970s. So it's been going on for half a century in different countries. And banks, banks heard banks have fads. Okay, if you're a banker and you go back to the subprime bubble in America and you weren't lending to subprime, you were ridiculed, okay? Because they were making these huge fees out of subprime and prices were rising. And you tell people, don't worry, borrow money, buy a house. You're on a hiding to nothing. The house price will rise. If you can't afford the house now, don't worry. Take out a loan you can't service, pay it off as best you can, and then when the house price has risen enough, sell the house for a profit, pay off the debt, and you can continue the same old process. That's called a Ponzi scheme. Okay? You're borrowing money to gamble the house prices rise. The fact that you're borrowing the money means that's what's causing house prices to rise. So it keeps on going until it busts. And that's what we went through in 2007. So left to their own devices, banks fund Ponzi schemes. You want to do two things. You want to limit the amount of lending they do to cause asset prices to rise, and you want to direct them to lend to actual manufacturers rather than lending to speculators. So I would, we've got to reverse mistakes to get to that point. So at the moment, roughly speaking, house prices, or the amount of debt people will take out to buy a house, can be sort of 20 times what the house would earn as rent. Okay. Now, the sustainable ratio of house prices to rental income from houses is around about 10. And I would set up a
10
set of meaning that the amount of money you can borrow to buy a house when house prices are sustainable is something of the order of 10 times the rental income the house will make. Because of this bubble in house prices, we're now looking at about 20 times.
So basically you are saying that is the mistake of banks that brought us to this, because they are focusing on this housing, they are giving to everyone loans without the restrictions, and because they are sure that they will get their house back if they worst case scenario.
They get the house.
So it's a good thing. So we need to restrict this with the laws.
Yep. And I'd set a set of rules that limit how much they can lend, and I'd enforce those rules using lawyers, not regulators.
Enforce those rules using
lawyers. In other words, judges.
What's the difference?
The difference is regulators are bureaucrats who can have their arms twisted, who can think about they might get a job in a bank at some stage, so they regulate fairly loosely. But if you have a law saying the maximum loan you can lend is 10 times your annual income of the property, and if you breach that law, then here's a 6-month jail sentence for you.
Okay, this is what
that sort of thing. Make it a legal thing.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you're starting like the ratio, say 20-1. I'd reduce the ratio every year of 10, 19, 18 to minimise the amount of money that's lent for housing. And then what you're doing is you're providing a loan for the sake of the service of having a house, not because you've turned housing into a speculative asset class. That's what we've done. So I'd do that. I'd provide credit guidance to banks. So I'd say, we want you to invest in solar. We want you to fund.
To tell them where to.
Yeah, and the Chinese do this on a grand scale. Okay.
Wow, that's interesting. Like on solar stuff, give these.
The Japanese did it before the Japanese made the mistake of getting caught up in what they call the bubble economy, when they had the biggest housing bubble and stock market bubble almost in history back in the 1980s. They used to do credit guidance as well. So MITI, the Ministry for Industry and Trade, I forgot what the ITI stands for, Ministry for Industry, Trade and Investment. They gave profit guidance, and they had engineers saying where they think, like engineers working for MITI, saying what they thought would be growth industries for Japan. And that's why Japan went from being, destroyed at the end of World War II to dominating the global economy by 1990. But then their bubble economy burst and they've destroyed themselves. They let that credit guidance go. Germany used to do credit guidance to industrial development. China's doing it now. So you want to have, you can't, nobody knows what's going to work necessarily, okay? But there's a role for the state in providing some sort of long-term guidance, because the private sector is really good at short-term profits. Okay?
Yes, but they're not. This is proven by this, what you explained with the houses and all this stuff.
Yeah, but banks have got a legitimate reason not to want to lend to entrepreneurs. They can lend to existing businesses. So if you look back in the 1960s, for example, a major way that banks did lending back then is what's called lines of credit. The line of credit is like a credit card for a large corporation. So they'd negotiate a deal, say, with General Motors for it's like a 100. I don't know what the figures. Let's say $10 billion as a line of credit, meaning that they had $10 billion of room, like a credit card. If they needed to spend more, hire workers or buy inputs, they could do it. That become unprofitable for banks over time compared to lending for housing. So what they've done is almost eliminated lines of credit like that. And that's why banks, a lot of corporations now issue what they call commercial paper. So that's where a lot of commercial bonds have come from. Banks providing working capital is a good thing. That's what they should be doing. So if you make it less profitable for banks to speculate, to lend to speculation on house prices, then they're more likely, therefore, to lend to companies for working capital.
Yes.
But I'd also want to have them lending for entrepreneurs as well.
And how do you make that lending for entrepreneurs?
Well, first of all, you take away the housing as a potential avenue. Eliminate one way.
Because you give them options, remove one option that is profitable for them, they will go to the other.
That's part of what I do. But I'd also recognise that one of the reasons they won't fund entrepreneurs, like I'm an entrepreneur in that sense. I'm developing a software package which I think will be very commercially successful, and I have no money myself. Okay? So if you fund an entrepreneur, in a sense, you're funding somebody with a good idea but no money. But the question is, you don't know which good idea is going to work. And if you gave a loan to somebody, there might be, say, 10 entrepreneurs, and one of them's going to succeed. You don't know in advance which one. You lend them all the same amount of money. You lose 90% of your money for the 9 that fail. You get interest on the money you've lent to the one who succeeds. It's a no-brainer. You don't lend to entrepreneurs. It's not worth the risk.
Yes.
But if you could give an equity charge, so the bank got what I call an equity loan rather than a debt loan.
So now they have this.
They take
have this ability or no?
They don't. They don't. It'd be a change to the regulations. But at the moment, when a bank makes a loan, it must be debt. At the moment, but I'd say make it equity.
Yeah. So it will be like hedge funds that.
That's in that sense. It's similar integrating the fund
or startup investors that they.
Yeah. And then in that case, if they gave money, if 9 out of the 10 fail, then they lose their capital for those 9. They make a bomb on the 10th, that sort of thing. So I call those entrepreneurial equity loans. So I'd bring those in. I'd make that feasible.
Another one problem I think we have in Cyprus, we only have 2 banks, major banks. So it's like a monopoly. So there is not a lot of. How do you think is? We should try to make more banks. You don't think that's
not as important? I mean, competition is overrated. Okay.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
I know. Well, competition. Conventional economics has got a totally false idea of how firms compete. They've got this idea of supply and demand curves, and it's all about equilibrium. And they imagine that there's just homogenous products being produced and all this sort of stuff. It's a complete myth. In the real world, competition tends to be, diversity of products. I mean, here's 2 versions of mineral water. Okay, they're exactly the same thing being sold in many different ways. That's what capitalism is about.
Which one you prefer?
I haven't tried this one. I'll try this. I was actually hoping it was coconut water. but that's capitalism is about diversity. And people compete by product differentiation. So that's the real world. We have a model instead that says homogenous products and we compete over price and all this sort of stuff. So their vision of competition says the more the better. Okay? Now, when you look in the real world, it's the more diversity, the better. But in fact, what you get out of that is a successful firm will become much, much larger than the ones that aren't successful. And that actually benefits the public because according to the conventional theory, the way they argue it, a big firm will produce a smaller quantity at a higher price. Okay? You look in the real world, the big firms produce a larger quantity at a lower price. Okay?
Yeah.
So the picture they've got is completely arse about tit, to use an Australian expression, and competition gives you a very small number of large firms and a large number of small firms, and you get a dynamic between the two, which is where evolutionary change comes from.
And this is healthy.
So,
And this is healthy.
This is healthy relatively. I mean, at the same time, you can get a monopoly. Like the big company can become so dominant that it exploits that power against both its own rivals and the rest of the world. So like one obvious example is Amazon, obviously. Now, Amazon, the reason Amazon succeeded is it enables you to get an incredible diversity of products at a really low price. So that's. I mean, I use Amazon.
And at your doorstep.
Sorry?
And at your doorstep.
Yeah, that's right. It's just instant delivery, So it's a remarkable service that wouldn't exist if we didn't have that big firm. But at the same time, not so much Amazon, but Apple. Apple can say, well, if you're going to sell any service through our phone, we're going to take 30%. And that's what my good mate Yanis Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism.
Yes.
And that's bad. So
Do you agree with him?
Yeah, on that one I do. I mean, Yanis and we've been mates for 35 years. So, there's some areas I think Yanis get things wrong, but we're all been, long-term friends, and he's right on that front. He's the one who pushed the idea that we've got now like a semi-feudal system where huge corporations like Apple and Facebook and so on, there's what they call network effects. Once there's dominant network, like Twitter is a dominant service for messaging, it's really hard to get anything else in there. And if you did, it'd make life more difficult. So you can get some big monopolies which exploit that power, and they have to be controlled or limited. But at the same time, capitalism will give birth to these huge corporations like Amazon, and we benefit from it. It's not a loss, but you want to constrain what damage it does elsewhere. But so the competition, the way competition theory is taught, says the more firms, the better. That's not true. It's a false measure. You want to enable the evolutionary competition that occurs that gives us the variety we get out of capitalism.
So you are pro-capitalist.
Pro-capitalist and anti-capitalist at the same time. Okay. we there's a tendency in the West to say left versus right, one extreme versus another.
This is what you said, ideology.
Yeah. When you look in Asia, one advantage Asia gets, I think, is yin and yang. There's a natural tendency in Asian society to think in terms of positives and negatives cooperating, complementing each other. So you have a complementary role. And I think that's partially why the Chinese have been so successful. They've got an extremely strong state system with rampant competition at the same time. And they've managed to balance the two. They don't see them as being in opposition. Whereas in the West, we go from, libertarians to socialists, and we go down one direction for a while and damage the system that way. Then we flip to the other and damage it in an opposite way. There's a symbiosis. And I think the Chinese have done far better at that than any society in history.
Okay, so you said about the banks to find a way to control. So you think that's the fundamental thing, that how you can manage the economy?
That's one major thing we have to get right. We've got banking. The way we think about banks, which conventional economists have created, is completely wrong. And it's demonized government deficits while ignoring and effectively praising large levels of private money creation for speculation on assets, which is completely wrong. The government should be creating fiat-backed money and building the infrastructure that gives you a framework in which capitalism can operate. And then the banks should be providing working capital to existing companies and funds for entrepreneurs and funds for consumers to buy large items like cars and houses as consumption items. That's what they should be doing. We've completely screwed the monetary system. Let banks do whatever they like as if it doesn't matter. And that's a large part of what's caused our crises, and constrained the government when the government should be building the infrastructure. And now you can see the failure of that in America and Europe versus what China is doing.
What about in energy? What are some policies in energy that can work?
Well, I think there's we have to get away from fossil fuels as fast as possible. So that would mean changing all the regulations about nuclear power to make it possible for nuclear power stations much more rapidly and cheaply. Get to the stage where you can produce nuclear powers in a production line, which that's difficult. It depends on the scale of the. If you talk about the water-cooled reactors and gigawatt scale of production, then that's extremely hard to do. You can't do that in a factory. But it's possible to imagine smaller nuclear reactors. There are limitations in the technology there as well, but it's possible to produce nuclear power stations much more rapidly and much more cheaply than we're doing in the West. I think I saw a comparison of Chinese costs for building a nuclear power station versus American, and the difference of about a factor of 7. The American power is 7 times as expensive for nuclear as the Chinese are. So if we copy what the Chinese have done.
What they did to have 7 times lower.
They can build power nuclear. The capital cost of a nuclear power station are huge if you're doing one of the conventional ones. And we're still a long way from being able to pump out, factory-made, lower capacity molten salt reactors and things like that. So you've got the huge capital item, but the American system is so expensive that when you get the cost of the energy, it's 7 times what the cost is for the Chinese. And that's a major reason why the Chinese are ahead there. Another technical thing, and again, I'm not an engineer, so I'm going on what my engineer friends tell me, is that we use alternating current to get electric power over large distances. The Chinese are using direct current. You've got to have a larger scale of energy to make the direct current work, but when you do it, it's far cheaper. So electric power from China can be distributed from one part of the continent to the other at minimal cost, whereas the Americans, it's huge cost. So all these sorts of things are things you can only do at the state level. You've got to say we're going to produce an energy transmission system, electric energy, that enables a far lower cost of energy for individual firms. And then you're going to have a potential to compete with China, whereas at the moment, China's slaughtering everybody, both through the rampant competition they've done at the individual firm level and then the state level way they've made the energy much, much cheaper for China than it is for the rest of the world.
And you are saying, so also the banks will play a role in this because you are going to make incentives to the banks to lend to make power plants like this or for solar and all this stuff. So that is the method that you will do.
A combination. One thing, one of my colleagues is a guy, I've got to remember his name out of the back of my brain right now, Avner Offer. And he wrote a book called The Public-Private Divide. And now, I've got some criticisms of the book, but he's basically on the right point. And he said that the private system is bad at building stuff that takes a long time to make a profit. And the simple reason is if you're going to build any piece of infrastructure, you might not get a return for 15 years.
Right.
You've therefore got to borrow the money and pay 15 years worth of compounding interest before you start getting a revenue. You don't even do it in the first place.
Yeah.
Or if you have something like sewage works and you've got to put a large amount of money into long-term maintenance, you'll ignore the long-term maintenance, then it'll break down. Whereas the government hasn't got those time constraints. So the government can do stuff that takes a long time to get a return, if at all. But you need that stuff you need for the rest of the economy. So the government should build sewage systems and government should build water systems and the government should build energy transmission systems, all that sort of stuff. It's
the
better
government should build.
They should be, yeah, they should. And we have to realise that there's a symbiosis between the private system and the public, whereas the way that the West sees it, the neoclassical theory basically argues that capitalism would be better with no government at all. So this destructive ideology towards government spending, which is the Western attitude, we're now seeing how badly that compares to the Chinese, where they see
you think
symbiosis.
What do you think? So you think symbiosis? So you don't think smaller government is better? You think a symbiosis like the Chinese are doing is the right model?
Yeah, and like even in terms of how they do their politics, I've had crazy experiences in my life over time, which it's silly that I've had the range of experience that I've had. But I was in China in 1981,
Wow.
running a seminar between Australian and Chinese journalists in the very first seminar that Chinese journalists ever did with any other country. So I've these little cameos that happen, and I've suddenly lost my bloody train of thought on that front.
But you were talking about but how was China in 1981?
Oh, it was amazing in terms of, it was a peasant society. The main thing you smelt in Beijing in December in 1981 was cabbage, because people were preserving cabbage for the winter, and they were opening it up, and all this preserved cabbage was being eaten. You could smell it in the city. And the tallest building in Beijing was probably 8 stories high. Shanghai, I think it's the southern side of the Bund River, was rice fields and small factories and stuff like that. Totally different to what you see today. So I was making a point, I've forgotten what it was about life experiences, but
you are talking about the Chinese model is better with symbiosis.
So when I ran that seminar, thank you. When I ran that seminar, we had like 9 Australian journalists, about 30 Chinese journalists, and sitting around us were a couple of hundred students from the local universities studying journalism. And those students asked me to give them information on the ombudsman system in Australia, because they'd heard we had an ombudsman system. And I was going through a relationship bust-up at the time, so I wasn't in the best of states of mind, and I forgot to send them the info. But the main interest the students had wasn't about left-wing versus right-wing politics. They wanted ombudsmen who restrained abusive behaviour by bureaucrats. So it was a Swedish system when it first came out. So I think what the Chinese have done is put a very strong anti-corruption unit inside all their government systems, and that anti-corruption thing constrains self-serving behaviour by those bureaucrats, pushes them towards doing
How
good.
does this work? I'm confused.
What it means is you have a way of you have a set of objectives set for a bureaucrat, and if they don't meet those objectives, they can be sacked. And that's part of the Chinese government system. So what it means is
you can fire them, basically.
You can fire them. So rather than like we get a flip-flop, left-wing government, right-wing government, build up public infrastructure, slash it. We flip-flop from one side to the other in the West, and we think that's democracy. Okay? What the Chinese say, democracy is constraining behaviour that dominates and exploits. So putting an ombudsman system inside the bureaucracy means that you don't get the Soviet-style outcomes where the bureaucrat tells you what to do and you're in terror if you don't do what the bureaucrat wants. Here, the bureaucrat's got a set of objectives that are being measured by another unit inside the government to make sure they reach those objectives. And if they don't, they get sacked. If they do, they get promoted. So in that sense, there's better government in China, even though you've only got a one-party system. So,
So it's important to have this, because if you have lifetime people with no incentive and they don't leave, that's how you create a bureaucracy that is not functioning.
Yeah, and like you see so many elements of that in the West. But also we tend to flip-flop left, right, rather than saying, let's just work out what the relationship of the state to the private sector should be and then develop it over time and get the government to specialise in what it's good at, which is long-term planning, infrastructure and so on, and let the private sector do what it's best at, which is the short-term innovation. And you get a symbiosis, you get that yin and yang. We flip and flop instead.
Wow. So I want to talk a bit about the future of Europe and what Europe economy is doing and like these types of things.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to admit I'm pessimistic. Okay, because China's got so far ahead of the rest of the world, it's going to be incredibly hard for Europe or America to catch up technologically. So if you, European cars now can't compete with Chinese cars, American cars can't compete with Chinese cars. So
they pass Teslas, the EVs now that they're making in China, the electric cars, they pass Teslas. They're selling more than Tesla
Yeah.
sells.
I mean, Tesla's got a lead in a few different areas, like its AI system.
Yeah, and self-driving and all this stuff.
Self-driving may be better than the Chinese, but the Chinese have done, like they've gone heavy for LiDAR, so they're using laser as well as visual, whereas Musk made the decision just to stick with visual systems. And so heavily reliant upon the AI and pattern recognition and so on. But it appears the Chinese might be ahead of them in terms of self-driving anyway. And then their energy costs are lower, their factories are more efficient. The thought of China and Europe being able to catch up really is a struggle. So
yeah, this is what I'm afraid. Like sometimes when I think about stuff, I'm stupid. I don't know about the economy, but I see so much technological advancement in China, also in the United States, nothing in the EU. And like we're also with the artificial intelligence rising up is, I think, the most important race in the history of civilization.
Yeah.
And like I see us behind in this. So I want your comments.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, I'm not a great fan. I don't believe AI is actually AI.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
It's brilliant pattern recognition. Okay, so if you want to get know what the current data is about something, then AI is great at finding it for you. I have friends who are like one of my work associates is a computer programmer, brilliant computer programmer. But a huge amount of issues in computer programming come down to some obscure piece of code in somebody else's software. You have no idea what it does, but it's stuffing up your system. Well, if you try to find it yourself, you're searching forever. You tell an AI to go and do it, it's going to check every article, it's going to find stuff you haven't found, it's likely to find the thing you need to do, fix it up, and it'll do it for you. But if you ask an AI to come up with a novel concept, it ain't going to do it. Okay? So the AI stands for artificial intelligence. I don't think we have artificial intelligence until we have artificial imagination.
Okay.
And that's large language models are unlikely to do that. There's a possibility that large language models might work out how to have imagination because they're hallucinating to some extent already, making the hallucinations more imaginative in that sense. You might finally get to the stage where they have self-awareness and where they can actually come up with new concepts. But fundamentally, AI is just recognizing existing patterns. So I think there's still an opening. If you actually wanted to generate genuine artificial imagination, then that's still an open field. But pattern recognition, the Americans and the Chinese have got it sewed up, and the Europeans are also rans. Not even also rans, really.
So what we can do in Europe to...
I think partially.
Do you think that one of the problems, because I think, maybe I'm just confirming if you think as well, is the so much bureaucracy and regulations that are killing innovation, or you don't think that's a problem?
Well, I mean, sometimes the regulations
or the culture, I don't know.
Well, it's partly scale. I mean, a huge reason for forming the European Union was to make it like the United States of Europe, and then give it a capacity to compete with the Americans. And that has probably been shot in the foot by the Maastricht Treaty that cut back the availability of money compared to what it was in America. So you didn't produce some giant corporations to match things like Tesla, for example. That innovation didn't occur in Europe.
Because of... You think the Maastricht Treaties?
The Maastricht Treaty is the main damage.
What we were describing before, that 3%.
And the 60%. That was pushed on you by what's called ordoliberalism, which is a German economic sect that's related to Austrian economics. But they believe like the Austrians are total libertarians. They say there should be no government regulations at all. The ordoliberals are like Austrian economists who believe you need strong regulation to stop the state getting in the way. So they use regulations to prevent the state doing anything, supposedly giving the private sector open slather. But by crushing fiat money creation, there simply wasn't the amount of money around for innovation without borrowing money in the first instance.
With crushing fiat money creation.
Yeah, but with the government running a deficit, you've got money circulating you can actually use for investment. Without that happening, you can only get money if you borrow, and so you get you end up with a ball and chain of private debt around your ankles because you're trying to avoid the government debt. It was a mistake. So the Americans...
You think that's the fundamental reason?
I think it's the fundamental. That's what I'd see as the fundamental issue. If you get rid of the Maastricht Treaty, you've got some chance to have a viable European United States of Europe. But the Maastricht Treaty is the main problem. And
neither countries that they have their own currency can do this because they have restrictions?
Well, I mean, it's the euro was a double whammy. I mean, you had a restriction on your government money creation, and you eliminated currency variations as well. So it was a double hindrance to Europe. If you didn't have the limitations of government spending and you didn't get rid of exchange rate adjustments, it could have been a more effective culture. So you've had 25 years of this damage, 30 years of the damage from the euro that you need to reverse. And it's, you haven't had the innovations to create anything like a Silicon Valley or a Tesla. And it's all, I think, come from this madness of trying to restrict government spending rather than creating the money and letting the private sector spend it and innovate. So, and I look at Europe and, you've got a much more decent society than America has.
Decent meaning?
Meaning social security is better here, health is better here. People aren't as conflictual as Americans are. There's a lot of conflict in Europe, as you know, but nothing on the scale of the social division in America. Yeah. Your cities, the fact that you have smaller, cities you can walk around, public transport within them that's more functional, all this stuff I think is a more desirable society by far than America. So you've got that potential strength to build upon.
The infrastructure is better.
Infrastructure is better as well. I came down from Amsterdam, cost me about €100 and took an hour and a half. If I was in an American city and had to make the same journey, it'd take me 3 or 4 hours by train and cost more money. Or I'd become a car and I'd be exhausted when I got here. There's ways in which Europe's got a better infrastructure than America has. I think you can see yourself as competing with America, but China is so far ahead, it's scary. And I think in some ways you're going to need capital controls and you're going to need protecting...
Capital controls, meaning?
Meaning you can't repatriate, like American corporation can't repatriate money easily back to America. Europe is still sort of running a trade surplus, still, I think, at the moment. And I see trade deficits as dangerous. There's modern monetary theories, which is another non-orthodox approach to economics.
We can talk about trade deals and all this stuff because they're very famous in this age.
Sorry?
These trade deals are very famous now in this age of tariffs and all this stuff.
Yeah. And that's a sign of how the vision of comparative advantage has failed, because rather than leading to free trade leading to wealth everywhere, it's led to inequality everywhere.
But do you think free trade is good?
No.
Okay.
No.
So you think tariffs? What Donald Trump is doing is healthy
to some extent, but it's been done very destructively and stupidly. You couldn't get a bigger moron running tariff policy than bloody Trump. Okay, but if you I have no intention to go into America for 4 years. So
it seems that you are not a Trump lover.
He's an idiot. He's an idiot and a narcissist, and incredibly destructive of American culture. So that's the one advantage Europe has is America's shooting itself on the foot right now.
Okay,
take advantage of it.
But you think tariffs are in a way somehow, if it's used well, healthy?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at empirical research on which countries have managed to develop over time and what have they done to develop it. The best guy is actually an American economist called Danny Roddick, R-O-D, I think it's R-O-D-R-I-K. It's either R-O-D-R-I-K or R-O-D-D-I-K. And he's done empirical examinations of which countries have developed versus which haven't. And what he's found is It's countries which did not do free trade that developed more rapidly. They protected domestic industry.
It's countries that they don't do.
Sorry?
It's countries that they don't do free trade.
They do not do free trade. They did better. So you had Japan, Korea, China initially. What they would do is they'd protect their domestic industry, but they'd put them under pressure at the same time. So they'd say, we're going to shield you from foreign competition, but we want you to be competitive with the foreigners within 5 years, that sort of thing. So like one of my favorite examples, another little funny cameo, was that I had the president of the Communist Party of South Korea came to work with me when I was in Australia for a while. And it was classic Stalinist personality. We didn't get on at all. But when he arrived, this is a communist, I got him an apartment to stay in, and he got out his laptop computer with an Ethernet cable, trying to plug it into the wall somewhere. And I said, there are no Ethernet cables. And he said, what? I said, we only have dial-up modems in Australia. You've got to, this is back in the days of telephone dial-up modems with 28,000 bits per second being a good speed rather than the megabits we're used to now. That's all he had. He said, why? He said, in South Korea, the government told all the telecommunications companies they had to provide a Ethernet input for every house in the country. They didn't care how they did it. It was just, if you wanted to be a telecommunications company in South Korea, you had to be part of a consortium that made sure that every house in South Korea had an Ethernet connection for the internet. That's where Samsung and all those technological advances came from. Every kid in South Korea had high-speed internet access, and therefore they could devise new companies on top of that. So all the technological development we've seen coming out of South Korea was started by a government system that told the private sector it had to give everybody very high-speed internet access. So that's the sort of way which the state can enable those developments to occur. Whereas the anti-state attitude of Europe says, leave it to the private sector, let it decide what to do, we can't plan, yada, yada, yada. Those are all just mistakes about setting up a functional system. You need the state to do the stuff which is vital for the long term but not profitable in the short term. So in terms of getting out of the dilemma Europe is currently in, you need to protect your industries initially.
So you think we should not do all these trade deals that we're doing with Mercosur or with India, we did like recently. You think we should do what America is doing and what these countries that you described try to force inside the European Union to build?
It's like if you're doing it 50 years ago, I would have said yes. My dilemma these days is that Europe has fallen so far behind China in particular that it's really hard to imagine any industry where Europe could create something competitive to replace contest with the Chinese, because
so we need trade with the Chinese because we are going to stay so much behind. This is what you're saying?
Yeah. I think you've got to find a way of limiting trade surpluses, because part of what's going on as well, and this is like where I differ completely with modern monetary theory. I actually argue that they're completely wrong on this point and they give bad advice. Modern monetary theory tells you it's good to run a trade deficit. I think that's stupid. When you
trade
look at
deficit, meaning that you get
more imports than exports.
Yes.
What the Chinese have done is more exports than imports on a grand scale. That is part of where they've created the money that enables them to industrialize. Now, again, I know my MMT people are probably screaming right now, and I don't care. I think they've got a totally erroneous vision of what is the relationship between trade surpluses and trade deficits. But my analysis shows that if you run a trade surplus, you actually create money domestically by doing that. That money goes to a firm which has been successful in industrializing, otherwise it wouldn't have the trade surplus to begin with. It then uses that money to develop its technology even faster and maintains an advantage that way.
So you're saying, like, for example, with America, we have a trade surplus. So that's healthy.
Yeah, but
we need to make sure that we have surpluses to be here.
Not everybody. The sum total of all trade surpluses is zero.
Say again.
The sum total of all trade surpluses on the planet is zero.
Why so?
Because exports, one country's exports is another country's imports. So the sum of all of them is zero.
Oh, okay.
So you've got that constraint. Okay. So what you want to do is limit the capacity for countries to run a trade surplus and exploit that as a way of investing and growing faster than other countries. Now, the current trade system.
Use that as to boost your economy.
Because China's succeeded.
To go faster.
China's succeeded partially because it's used a trade surplus to industrialize faster than Europe. So there's and this is one of the only things I can see that are good at coming out of bloody Donald Trump. People are realizing the current monetary system, global monetary system where the American dollar dominates, is bad. Okay? And we got that system because the Americans insisted upon it at the Bretton Woods Agreement. Keynes put forward an idea instead. There were two ideas at the Bretton Woods Conference. One was make the American dollar the international currency, and that's what we got. Keynes's was to use a clearinghouse he called the International Clearing Union, using a unit of account that he called the Bancor, where a country running a trade surplus would run up a surplus at the clearing union, and a country running a deficit would run up an overdraft, and the sum of the two would be zero, like international trade. And you then had penalty rates of interest on large surpluses and large deficits. So it limited how large trade deficits could get to be in trade surpluses. China's running a trade surplus right now of the order of 10% of its GDP. Now that forces an identical trade deficit in the rest of the world, which means they can't invest as fast. So Keynes's idea was to limit that. We got stuck with the American system, and that people believe that floating exchange rates, which came in from 1972, would eliminate trade deficits and surpluses. Well, look, we're 50 years after that, and there's no way they've got bigger, if anything. So we need a system that limits them, and then with that system limited, you reduce the extent to which China can grow at the expense of the rest of the world. So something that went in the direction of bringing in a concept like Keynes's Bancor, I think would be a way of addressing the unfair advantage that China's got out of its trade surpluses. Still hard to do.
Interesting. I thought that, for me, I thought that all trade is good because it helps the consumer to get lower prices. But when you put it that way, when we are losing money to the other country, it's like we are benefiting the other country more than we are benefiting ourselves.
I mean, I've done a little. The argument over trade deficits and trade surplus is controversial. Okay? Conventional economists believe the market system will take care of it. Well, that hasn't happened over 50 years, so if you can rule that out. Modern monetary theory has brilliant ideas about government spending. It says the government doesn't tax to spend, it spends to tax. So we've got it exactly aligned on government deficits and saying you need government deficits to create part of the money supply that enables you to have a developed physical economy as well. But they have this idea, they say exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. And I think it's brain dead stupid. I'm sorry, I know I'm going to offend a lot of people on my side of politics and my side of economics, but I think it's just stupid, that argument. What you can see is that a trade surplus creates money for the trade surplus country. It reduces money supply for the trade deficit country, and that's partially where China's got ahead of the rest of the world. It's made this huge trade surplus, reinvested it. That's why its technology got so far ahead of the rest of the world. But the thing is, when you're running a trade surplus like that, you're very unwilling to have your behaviour controlled. So you go back to the end of World War II, that was the situation America was in. Europe had been devastated. Japan had been destroyed. Okay, America's running a huge trade surplus. They thought they were going to ride their trade surplus forever. So Keynes's proposal would have limited them in that front. They said, no, fuck off. We're going to have a free system where we can, free market system. And they believe they're going to have a trade surplus forever. But of course, because we were using the American currency for international trade, there was demand for the American dollar over and above the demand for American goods, which means American dollar is overvalued, which means its manufacturing sector is less competitive. So that trade surplus disappeared over time. And now America is one of the biggest trade deficit countries. And that's partially why China, with a trade surplus, has outdone them. So we need a system. And I'm totally against the Maastricht Treaty as a way of controlling government deficits, but I believe we need an international system that limits trade deficits because they are a zero-sum game. So and in my argument, the trade surplus benefits the trade surplus country, unless there are situations where some countries are forced to run a trade surplus because they've got huge debt in foreign currency they've got to repay, and they're screwed. That's the situation of Gabon and the Congo and so on. They're forced to export what they could use domestically. But for industrial countries like America, Europe, China, and so on, trade surpluses are a positive and trade deficits are a negative. So I would want to bring about a system that restrains it. And Keynes's idea, what he called the Bancor, and I've renamed the Terror, would actually limit those and then limit the advantage that countries that run surpluses can get. And with that, if you're trying to do something to revive Europe without overcoming that problem, then I think it's not easy.
Let's go to wars.
Wars.
Yes, we're in war in Europe.
Yeah.
So I want you to comment on how does that affect us economically? How did this affect Russia economically? I don't know if you want to make a small bathroom break and then we'll continue with this.
I'm doing okay at the moment. Do you want to make a bathroom break?
No.
Okay,
I'm good.
I'm still surviving, old man, but I'll get there.
Okay, tell me about what you think about this.
Oh, yeah, I wish we could take. Are you religious?
Yes.
Okay, which religion?
Christian Orthodox.
Okay. I'm a Sagan.
Okay.
That's named after Carl Sagan. Okay.
That's why I was confused.
I know, Sagan pagan. It's just good. Carl Sagan said this brilliant photograph where he got the Voyager craft to be turned around to take a photograph of the Earth just as it was leaving the solar system. He said this tiny little dot. Wasn't even one pixel in the photograph. He said, everybody you know, every empire, every fight, every person is on that little dot, okay? We all have this planet in common. Why the hell are we trying to kill each other on this planet? Okay? So the competitive attitude we have, the wars that we fight, are all as if we're independent of each other. We're all on that same bloody little dot. We're all we should not be destroying each other. Okay, we shouldn't be destroying the biosphere either. We're doing both, and obviously wars are a dramatic way of damaging the biosphere. So I think we should try to get to the point where we realise we're on this tiny blue dot, and that should be our attitude to wars in the first instance, rather than ending up in war after war after war. And a huge part of this, again, comes out of the ideology of the West, communism versus capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. It's mainly a huge part is exploiting energy resources. Factions that you get, that's why America invaded Iraq, as stupid as it was. So I'm a critic of wars in general. And I certainly don't, the whole idea that you can have a war-led recovery, which I'm seeing people talking about in Europe, weapons manufacturing to make up. That's insane.
Explain what you mean.
A war, by definition, destroys physical resources, and we're using that as a way to grow. If you made the weapons and never used them, that'd be a form of stimulus. Economic stimulus, pay for the money to make things you never use. That's why you can stimulate the economy as long as you don't use what you produce. Now, if you actually end up using what you produce, you get a bit of a stimulus here and you destroy productive resources where the war occurs. So we're doing that to Ukraine. It's being done to Gaza. It's horrific to imagine that those conflicts are going to be used as a form of growth. It's ludicrous thinking. So what it comes down to is we're trying to control different physical resources on the planet as if there's not enough for everybody, and we're going to secure our bit and get it at your expense. And to me, it's a sign of how primitive we are as a species that we can even think that's a good idea. At the same time, I can't see a peaceful resolution of Europe over Ukraine. It's the ideological conflicts are so extreme. A large part of that's come from NATO pushing itself forward and telling the Russians they wouldn't encroach upon the borders, and then breaking their own promises and doing it. So in other ways, I blame NATO and the Americans for the fact we've got a war in Ukraine in the first place. Okay? We just need recognition of our own flaws in that process. And I think Putin drastically overstepped the mark by trying to invade the whole of Ukraine rather than just taking the Donbass region, which is what I thought he would do. But it's the fact that we fight these wars and people are talking about a war-led recovery just shows what stupid bloody animals we are.
So you think the economic side that they are saying, and also you think because it's not only building the industry for war and all this stuff, it's also sanctions. So sanctions, what is your thoughts about sanctions? Do they work? Do they don't work? In case of Russia, did it had an effect?
I haven't followed the Russian economy on that front, so I can't say for sure. But like sanctions, the sanctions are used for China. They said we wouldn't let you use AMSL. Was it AMSL? The Dutch company that makes the machines that make absolute micron level chips. So what have they done? They've manufactured their own variation. So sanctions can backfire on you with a large economy, but sanctions obviously worked in the case of South Africa to break apartheid. So, sanctions can work in some circumstances, but I think the sanctions for Russia, Russia's managed to evade those sanctions by sending oil through third countries. So there has to be a resolution of that conflict that recognised the mistake that NATO made in expanding into Russian territory when they promised they wouldn't do it. And Sachs, you've known Jeffrey Sachs, of course.
We did podcast.
Yeah. Have you done a podcast with him?
A lot of them.
Okay, righto. I ended up having a fight with Jeffrey over Twitter back when it was worth fighting on.
Okay.
Yeah, because I was he was involved in the shock therapy arguments for Russia. And he was very confident neoclassical economist. And there's one of his papers where he talks about the transition from socialism to capitalism, okay, and said that it obviously should happen quickly because if you read the neoclassical papers about the transition, they all said the faster the better. Okay? And one of these articles, Sachs said that the idea that we should do the transition gradually is obviously silly. I mean, if you wanted to go from more water. I think we're doing okay. If you wanted to go from cars driving on the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the road, would you do it gradually, so by moving the trucks across on day one and leaving the cars for day two? And it's ridicule like that. Now, the Chinese, when they were pushed for the same rapid transition, they used the analogy of crossing a stream and saying, if you cross a stream, you want to go forward 1 foot at a time to find the rock to stand on. You do it slowly. Well, look what Russia versus China today. Okay? So the rapid transition is part of what destroyed Russia. Now, I made a comment about that article by Sachs on a bus that I was travelling on in London with friends of mine who were showing the extent to which Russian oligarchs own housing, expensive housing in London. So I don't know whether I tweeted it out. Sachs replied to me and attacked me and said, look, I've been fighting against the State Department because what he realised, he had that naive attitude initially. Then he got involved because of his prominence with the State Department and realised that the American State Department wasn't trying to get Russia to go from socialism to capitalism, they were trying to destroy Russia. Okay? So you saw, rather than there being a transition, they were trying to fuck them up. And they succeeded. So that's why you had the collapse of the Russian industry after, like not just the collapse of the wall, but you had under Yeltsin, huge collapse in the economy. It got taken over by the oligarchs because they were the only ones who could rapidly move to take advantage of the sale of all the state enterprises into the private sector. And then the Americans are still trying to destroy Russia. Okay? They've never wanted to have a rival at their level. They're having the same attitude to China now. This to me is all incredibly destructive, and it's the militaristic and warlike nature of the American economy that has given this behaviour, and we should be trying to go in the opposite direction.
Okay, so...
by the way, Jeffrey did come back, and he was offended that but he did write those articles, he did support shock therapy, but once he got inside the State Department and saw what they were doing, he tried to prevent it, and he said he was overruled by the Larry Summers and those sorts of people. So, I had to concede that Jeffrey Sachs, having made a huge mistake, has done his best to reverse it, and he's now one of the most important people arguing for a democratic and humanist approach to economic theory. So he made a mistake and he's reversed his direction.
Yes,
I appreciate him for that.
It's amazing, and it shows that you can change your mind when you're presented to
criticize him for his original stuff, but compliments galore for what he's done since.
Just checking.
Yeah, of course, we're going for a long, long time.
Yeah. Everything is okay. So we have been talking about a war, but I wanted to ask your opinion. So, being powerful as a country, as I understand, is how the world works. The more power you have, the more we're living in an anarchic system of countries, and the most powerful can do whatever they want to the others, like we saw in Venezuela, and all this stuff. So, and they can get away with it because
they're powerful. Yeah.
So, in a way, it's important for the survival of a country to be powerful. So what do you think about the spending of defense in every country?
It's a necessity given the fact we're trying to destroy each other and power does rule. So unfortunately, it's a necessity given how conflictual we are as a species. That's why the United Nations and all those ideas were there to try to restrain it. They succeeded for a while, but they've failed since.
Sometimes they succeed, but...
Yeah. I mean, I know when I was a young child, I was your age, okay? A long time ago.
Wow.
50 bloody years ago. The lefties were all against what's called, if you heard the doctrine of MAD, mutually assured destruction, MAD. Okay, so that was the argument about the build-up of nuclear weapons by both Russia and America, that you wouldn't dare use them because, if you did, there'd be a war which would kill you anyway. So the fact that there was mutually assured destruction stopped wars breaking out between 1945 and, now. Okay? And I think that was true. The fact that Russia had such a huge arsenal that if you did attack them, there'd be enough of their arsenal left to wipe you out was one reason why the World War II was the last world war, So I think that strategy actually worked. Now, with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, that mutually assured destruction issue is gone to anything like it was back in the Soviet days. So America's got a much freer hand, and they're therefore, all the invasions, all the wars they've done, it's just a destructive element of the American culture, and it forces the rest of us to respond by having military to fight back against them or to block them. It's a horrible dilemma of humanity. But I think what worries me is that should make us think we've got to work together to avoid destroying life on this biosphere, but we're more likely to continue doing it. So, it makes me very pessimistic about our potential to survive the challenges we're facing, because they're going to come out of the damage we do to the biosphere.
Yeah. And it's crazy also because there is this thing called the defense dilemma. So when we are defending ourselves, like for example, Cyprus is occupied by Turkey.
Yeah.
We had an invasion in 1974. So when we defend ourselves, when we're trying to make army and to defend ourselves, to protect in the future, like maybe the other person will see it as a threat, and they are starting to develop the army. And the other country, because they are starting to develop that, they take it as a threat. So it's like a dangerous system. Everyone is trying to defend, and everyone's taking the other person that is trying to defend as a threat, and they defend more. So it's like, it's a weird world that we're living in.
And it's even worse now. We've got things like drones as weapons, because it means that the type of conflict we can do, armies can be wiped out by drones.
I'm trained in the army. I was Navy SEAL in the army. So I'm stupid because I am incapable. There is a drone there. I was trained to kill people, and like I was good, not to kill people, but in the training, all this stuff. And now one drone can hit me with thermal camera, can hit me from. I cannot defend myself.
About it.
And the 80% of the casualties in the war in Ukraine and Russia is from drone. So but the question is, we should try to make incentives for in the economy for us to build the defense industry in-house in the country. So we should use also this stuff with banks and all this stuff to defend ourselves, to have like companies to innovate with drone technology and all this stuff. So now we're talking about dangerous territories.
It's weird. I mean, like at least with the advantage with the nuclear technology, only very few countries could do it. And B, the devastation was so widespread that you'd never imagine using them. But drones, anybody can make. Obviously, there's variations in how good they are, but anybody can create a drone, and the capacity to defend yourself against the drones is almost non-existent. So have you ever seen, this, being my age, I've got a few classic old movies you might not have seen. Have you seen The Day the Earth Stood Still?
No.
Okay, it's a fascinating 1950s sci-fi movie. So a flying saucer lands, and a man walks out of the flying saucer, like a human scale. Special effects weren't all that good back in the 50s. So a man walks out, called Michael Rennie in terms of the actor, and he gets shot by Americans, and then a robot comes out and destroys the things which shot him. He gets rescued, and finally he leaves the whole planet. Ultimately, the robot, they explained that on the planet he came from, they had so many wars that they finally decided that the act of warlike behaviour would lead to the robots exterminating the culture that was responsible for the war. So they said, we don't care what you do on your own planet, but once you get into outer space, if you do anything violent, our robots will come and destroy you. And so you had a force independent of humans in that sense. Any behaviour of violent behaviour would lead to you being exterminated by the robots. And I hate to say it, but looks about the only way we can stop ourselves killing each other is by saying, here's like an international force we're creating. Any form of warfare or racism, whatever else, you'll be dealt with.
Interesting. That's interesting thought.
Yeah, it's never going to happen. But like the fact that we end up in conflict all the time.
Why not?
Yeah, true.
Never say never.
Yeah.
It's a long shot, of course. But so you spoke about robots. I'm thinking about the future. I see what Elon Musk is building with Optimus robots, the Neuralink stuff. There is now with so much, like a lot of jobs are going to disappear.
Yeah.
So I want to talk with you about what you think the future will bring. And also in one of the reasons that I was excited to get elected here is because I think it's the most important time in the world now to be a regulator, because there is going to be a lot of change with technology. So in a way to manage it from policy perspective. So so now I'm very confused in what we should do as policymakers. We should because universal basic income comes now, the productivity of the world will increase, a lot of jobs will be lost. So I'm here having the sense that it's changing, but I don't know
it's a huge challenge because if we survive global warming, if we get through that and don't wipe ourselves out, then we are literally on the verge of being able to create machinery that can replace manual labor. Okay, I've got friends in engineering claim it can never happen. I disagree with them on this. I can see the developers are seeing in robotics where they've got robots with incredibly dexterous fingers and hands who can be trained to do virtually any manual job. And what that means in the short term is immense profit for the firm that actually makes the robots. But if we get to the stage where robots can replace any manual job and do it more cheaply than the worker, then the whole basis of working class income disappears. Okay? And also the basis of demand in a capitalist economy disappears because a large part of demand is selling to workers. So if workers can't get jobs in factories, and if workers therefore don't have the money for demand, you undercut the manufacturing system itself. So you've got to have moving towards something like a universal basic income. And you can see Elon Musk talks about this, the most extreme wealth inequality on the planet. The guy who's got that wealth is saying we want to have universal, he said universal high income is what he's aiming for. And technically it's feasible because if I bring it back to the whole energy issue that I began with, to produce output, we use energy to transform matter and transform energy into more useful forms as well. And human labor has been an essential part of that because there are some things you can't build a machine to do a specific job. It's far cheaper to have a human doing that job. And process workers, have you ever worked as a process worker?
No.
I have. Back in my student days, it was common. Back in the 1970s, get a part-time job, you're working in a factory. So I've worked in a sheet metal factory. I've worked in two sheet metal factories, in fact. One is a very small one with about 10 employees, the other hundreds, okay? And so I've seen manufacturing from the inside on that front. And you were doing stuff which you had to do it because it was too expensive to make a machine to do it. Now, as machinery has advanced over time, but also robots, you can have a human show a robot how to do something and it can replicate the hand movements that do it. So you take away that source of income for workers. And therefore, if you do it on a grand enough scale and the robots end up being cheaper for the people buying them than workers were, then workers lose the only thing that's given them employment and income, which is then labour's needed to produce output. So if you get into that situation, the only way you can have a functional system is with a universal basic income. In other words, the government has to give people enough money to enable them to buy the goods and services to keep themselves alive. So, and therefore, and I've seen quite a few of the tech bros like Elon Musk himself saying we need a universal basic income. I think they're right. So we need, and that means that...
And that will not break the economy because the productivity will happen.
Higher productivity coming out of the technology gives you the higher productivity. The government could create the money that enables people to live, but not necessarily thrive. So if you want to thrive, you've got to be an entrepreneur. So that's the sort of world that the tech bros are talking about. And I think we do face that world.
When do you think this will be coming in 10 years from now?
Well, no, the number of robots needed becomes huge. I mean, there's 8 billion humans. Right? Musk is talking about 8 billion robots.
No, he's talking about more robots, actually. Sorry? He's talking about more robots. He said he will be more robots than humans.
Well, then you've got to look at to make a robot, you need metal. You need copper. You need all the minerals that are necessary. I don't think he's right. I think the scale of mineral usage that's necessary to make that many robots is beyond what we have the capacity for on the planet to begin with. So they're not going to be as universal initially as they're arguing because the sheer...
But the cars, so many cars, how many billions of cars there are?
Yeah.
So there is the capacity, isn't it?
Well, there is at the moment, but they're like electric cars. There must be 2 billion cars on the planet. Okay, but to produce, 8 billion robots or 20 billion robots, you've got enormous needs for minerals to take the matter in the planet and turn it into a functioning robot of that scale. So I think we're going to find the material demands are going to be a slowdown in how fast we can get there. But fundamentally, over time, we could get there. And if you got to the stage where the robots are doing all the work, then what do the humans do? Well, the humans should not be working. The whole
and I think that's a good world.
It's a potentially good world, yeah.
Because a lot of people are very afraid of this. We're going to lose me and all this stuff. But I love my job. I love
mine. Yeah,
I was a YouTuber. I loved it. But most of the people, as I understand, they don't like their
they're boring.
jobs.
Have you read Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber?
No.
Well, have a fun read. So David argued like the vast majority of jobs people do these are actually bullshit jobs. They don't produce anything worthwhile.
Yeah, and people don't like their jobs.
Yeah.
So they will be more happier to go do their hobbies, go spend time with their families and all this stuff. So for me, it's a better world.
Potentially a better world. Yeah.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Potentially.
And
so you agree with this?
I agree. Like there's the first person to really talk about this was Buckminster Fuller.
What time?
Heard of him? His name, a wonderful name, Buckminster Fuller.
What time he spoke about?
1960s.
Okay.
And geodesic domes?
No.
They're domes which are made of hexagons and pentagons of shape.
Okay.
Well, he invented that idea of So he's known. You'll hear of there's an atom of carbon called C60, where 60 carbon atoms form together into what's called a Buckminster Fuller marine. Yeah. So he's well known in engineering, but he was sitting in the car one day, stuck in a traffic jam somewhere, and he started to idly think about all the engines still running. And he said, what would it be in equivalent in humans pushing each car to get the cars to do what they currently do by burning oil? And he worked out that each car had effectively 500 fossil fuel slaves. If you wanted to move around like we do in the 60s, you'd need 500 slaves per person to do that. Now we get to where we are with robots, and with robots exploiting energy, it's like having a slave who doesn't mind being a slave.
Yeah.
And we all benefit out of this mechanical slaves that do the work for us. So we can live the life of, Roman wealthy oligarchs in Rome who live a life of leisure, and they can write philosophy and they can do paintings and build sculptures. And so or they can play football and play sport all day. So you have a vision in which you're not exploiting animals, you're not exploiting other humans, you're exploiting energy through machines that have been built to be able to do that, that don't have a soul and don't feel exploited and oppressed by the fact they're doing it. That's the dream of ultimate human civilization.
Yeah. And I was a bit skeptical about this, but then I thought about, we play chess. Chess, now the machines are better than us in chess.
Yeah.
And now, but still people watch chess, still people play
Between
chess.
people.
Between people.
Yeah.
So it's like we're going to have our own maybe little world of like competing and enjoying life, doing hobbies and all this stuff, and still going to be probably fun. And we're going to discover so many more things that will be interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful.
To me, we this is why I say it's like a Star Trek episode. We're on the verge. It's the last 30 seconds of the show. You either end up solving the problem or you get wiped out by the Klingons. We're so close to wiping ourselves out through global warming. But if we survive that, we don't destroy the biosphere, then we have got this future of plenty. And it could mean a world in which, people live for the sake of knowledge and for the sake of fun, rather than being caught up in the effort and having to slave away at jobs they don't like and do things they find boring, and then have just, if they're lucky, 1 or 2 days on the weekend where they can do what they enjoy. You instead make it possible to enjoy your time all the time. And that'd be a far more creative future for humanity than where we are right now. So it's a promise that I would love to see us fulfill, but I think we're going to destroy ourselves on the way through with the impact of global warming.
So you are more pessimistic.
I'm more pessimistic.
So you think it's more likely for us to destroy ourselves?
I do.
What's the chances? You think 70, 30, 60,
I'm
40?
in the 90 to 95%.
95%?
If you force me to make a bet on what the likelihood of humanity making it to 2050 as a functioning civilization, I'd take 1 in 20 odds against it.
Wow.
Because a whole lot of things. I mean,
so fucking pessimistic.
I know. I'm not a pessimist by nature. I'm an optimist. I like. I've got a positive attitude towards life.
But when you are thinking about the facts, this is
see what we're doing and see how we're stuffing ourselves up and all the crazy political decisions that are made that make things worse when people think they're making things better. The damage to the biosphere that they think is under control and they don't know.
And you think that's largely because of global warming?
Global warming and damaging the biosphere.
Danger.
Yeah.
You think it's not artificial intelligence that would take over and all this stuff. You think that's the danger?
That's the basic danger. Yeah. Like when we realize that's happening, and if we start seeing, and we will start seeing climatic events that wipe out productive capability on a large scale and kill large numbers of people, then we're likely to go into warfare against each other to try to hang on to the remaining resources. So rather than realizing, oh shit, we've stuffed up, we have to all regard ourselves as being in this and we're trying to get out of the problem as best we can, we're likely to go and say we're going to invade that Navy country next door. Our food production have collapsed. They've still got food. Let's go and invade them and take the food. Warfare breaks out. I hate the thought, but that's more what I expect us to do than to say we have to collectively reduce the load that humans put on the biosphere. And I can see destruction rather than the sort of optimistic life of plenty we could have because we are technologically so close from being able to have it.
Okay, so I think 2-3 more lighter questions and then we can. So what makes you excited of waking up every morning?
Well, the possibility of avoiding catastrophe. That's because we know so much about the universe that we didn't know 250 years ago. So as much as I'll criticize how we've overused fossil fuels, the knowledge we've gained in the last quarter of a millennium is absolutely stunning. So we know, like if you go back even 100 years, humans didn't know that there was more than one galaxy.
Yeah.
Okay.
We thought that we're the center of the Earth.
It was 1930s because you had the Magellan Clouds. People realized the Magellan Clouds weren't something inside what we called the Milky Way. There was something outside the Milky Way when we thought the Milky Way was the entire universe. So suddenly we realized rather than like one galaxy, and that's the whole universe, there's hundreds of billions of galaxies. We know that now. That's knowledge that we didn't have about the nature of reality even a century ago. The technological stuff we exploit without even thinking about it. If you told somebody in 1850 that in a century's time, people would be flying between continents in Earth, they'd call you a fool. That's what we did. Okay, knowledge of quantum mechanics, knowledge of relativity, the things we've learnt about reality are just stunning. And the biggest tragedy that I can see is losing that knowledge. But if we go through a climatic breakdown where hundreds of millions and billions of people die of starvation or other drastic climate events, we're likely to go back into our religious hole and see everything about demons and evil people, and we're going to go anti-technology. So technology's got us here. Science has got us here. People will blame the scientists rather than the capitalists for the destruction of life on the planet. And then the response would be to become anti-technology and lose all that knowledge and go backwards. And to me, the thing which I think I wish we could become is regard ourselves as custodians of life on the planet, rather than destroyers of life on the planet, and to reserve a large part of the planet for non-human life to enable evolution to continue, reduce our demand on the biosphere, and get to the point where we can take our civilization off planet. Again, we're incredibly close to that. So the thing that keeps me alive, I'm still to some extent a fan of Musk getting to Mars, because that's the very first step in becoming multi-planetary, and I agree that's what we need to achieve. I don't think he'll do it. I think he's fucked up too much, and I think the Chinese will beat him, and I hope the Chinese do.
Fucked up too much? What do you mean?
Oh, the time he wasted being bloody lapdog of Donald Trump and the nonsense over Doge and his right-wing politics, he's he's anti-multicultural and all this sort of stuff. I see that as being totally negative. The Chinese, 2 decades ago, you wouldn't have thought the Chinese would beat America to Mars. Now I think I'd bet on the Chinese getting there first. Their technological level has risen so much over that period of time. But that's what makes me optimistic, the thought we could manage to take ourselves away from damaging the biosphere and move into it doesn't have to be outer space. I mean, some of the concepts that I keep an eye on are the ideas of putting a rail system around the planet 100 kilometres up, and then production occurs on those rail systems.
Rail system, say again?
You would have heard of space elevators? Okay.
No.
Okay. The people are trying to say, how do we get production off planet? Okay. And the difficulty with getting off the surface of the planet is gravity. And so we just barely able to get chemical-driven rockets off the planet, and it's incredibly difficult and so on. People thought about space elevators, so you can get an elevator up to space, but you need something in geosynchronous orbit to connect to, and there's no cables that can do it. Other people have dreamt up the idea of having a rail system. So you put satellites in orbit very close to the planet, maybe 100 or 200 kilometres up, no higher than that. You then link them, so you've got a ring rotating around the planet. And because it's a ring, it's self-sustaining to some extent. So you can put another ring inside it. That ring continues to rotate at orbital velocity. The one inside is stationary. You then have rail services. You only go 100 kilometres. We can build something 100 kilometres long that leads up to space. So you could have rail going up to 100 kilometres and back down again. And you could then have production on the rings, and you could have multiple rings rather than production on the surface of the planet. Now, if we do that, we dump our waste into the solar system. We don't dump the waste on the biosphere. We stop damaging the biological processes that are vital down here.
Would you think is it good?
It's feasible. Yeah, it's good and it's feasible.
It's the first time that I heard about this. This sounds crazy. It's the first time I heard about this rail.
Yeah.
It sounds crazy.
But it's feasible. We've got the technology to do it now. If we made that our objective, we could take the damage we do on the biosphere would cease.
But why not to go and build stuff on other planets?
That's far more complicated, far more difficult.
So we want to have the industry stuff happening outside the sphere of Earth. Orbiting there.
That's the most feasible. I mean, that's got huge material loads as well. We probably need to be using asteroids, capturing asteroids, bringing them back into orbit around the Earth, mining the asteroids. All this stuff is feasible. We are the fact that space has got this far in the last 20 years, and again, you've got to thank Musk for that. As much as I criticise him on other fronts, his determination to get rockets off, he's
admirable.
Yeah, you've got to admire him for that. Everything else that fucks up and all the other nonsense he's doing, but the stuff he did on rockets was something which could be a means by which humans stop damaging the biosphere of the Earth. And we have to do that to be able to survive as a species and for life to continue. So I'm never going to denigrate him over that. Okay?
So huge industries can evolve outside.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can have satellites to get energy from the sun,
And
solar
transmit it back
power.
to the earth and so on. Yeah.
So we can have all this in that, and also maybe it's cheaper up there, or more, or it would be more expensive.
Well, no, it's expensive to get it there, and again, it's the physical constraints are enormous. When you look at what's involved in getting rockets to take matter from the planet surface of the planet to orbit, like the amount of energy that's necessary to do that is mind-blowing. The amount of fuel that a Falcon 9 rocket consumes per second is something like about 3 tons per second. It's combining oxygen with methane, the rocket fuels and so on. But when you look back at the James Watt steam engine, that used 30 tons of coal per day to do equivalent of 100 horsepower. We are now using 3 tons per second. So that's the increase in the energy that's necessary to get there. But we've done it. So we're so close to be able to say, well, having made that step, we now get into outer space, bring asteroids back so we've got the matter, we don't have to hassles about running out of the minerals we've got on the planet itself. All that's incredibly complicated. That's the challenge we should have. And like if you look back and see where the space race initially came from, the space race was out of a contest that John F. Kennedy did to be the first people into outer space. And the Russians, the reason he did it was because the Russians beat him there with Sputnik. The very first satellite was made by the Soviets, not by the Americans. So that ideological competition is what led to the moon effort. And once we got to the moon with Apollo 13, we were so close to being able to do what we're doing 40 years later. And who stopped us? Economists and people worrying about government deficits. The space race was blocked because the funding for NASA was cut by a factor of 10 to balance the budget. So economists fucked us up on that front as well.
Interesting.
So I do wish for that future. I think we could be the generation that sees the first examples of humans building sustaining life systems off the planet. And we have to do that to survive as a species. So I wish we were doing that rather than blowing each other up.
Another light question about immigration. It's not a light question.
Yeah.
So do you think immigration is a problem? Do you think it's useful? Do you think having
I'm
more kids?
I'm a product of immigration. In a sense, first of all, I'm white. So I'm not a native Australian. Okay.
I'm talking also about the illegal immigration.
Sorry?
I'm talking also about illegal immigration and
Yeah. I
asylum
mean,
and all this
where does
stuff.
illegal immigration come from? The breakdown of social systems in other parts of the world. So why people are migrating from Iraq, for example, because America bombed the shit out of it 20 years ago. So a lot of our immigration is driven by our conflict. If we had less conflict, we'd have less immigration. So we've created the things we're complaining about.
Same with Syria right now.
Yeah, Palestine. I mean, we're just driving people out of areas and wondering why they come to our country because you bombed the shit out of us.
Okay.
So that's one issue. But and like as an Australian as well, white Australian, Australian culture when I was growing up as a kid was incredibly boring. I mean, there were 4 decent restaurants in Sydney, roughly speaking. Then, when the collapse when the Vietnam War collapsed, you had lots of refugees coming out of Vietnam, but particularly also Cambodia. The Australian government at the time, which was a conservative government, led by a guy called Malcolm Fraser, so basically said we're going to let in all the refugees who want to come from Vietnam and Cambodia. There's a dramatic increase in Asian population in Australia, and suddenly Australian food got to be interesting. And with this mixture of cultures was really, I think Australia benefited immensely from that. So I'm a fan of immigration on that scale. But at the same time, if you have immigration over the level of movement we're seeing now, and people being driven away from, particularly Africans being driven away by what we did to Libya. Lots of the refugees in Europe from Africa are due to America destroying Libya, and then wondering why I have refugees here. That can start undermining a culture. You need there can be too much immigration at a particular point in time. I think we're certainly...
What is too much?
2 or 3% per annum of the population. If most of your population growth comes from immigration, when you have population growth, then you can...
So, but you're talking about legal immigration now, not illegal immigration, right?
Well, illegal immigration exists because we've illegally invaded other countries and bashed the shit out of them. And the people are leaving to get away from a collapsing culture where they are. We're paying immigration. Illegal immigration is a consequence for illegal wars. And the country which has overwhelmingly caused the vast majority of illegal wars is America. So they're reaping what they sow in that sense. So I'm sympathetic to the refugees. What we should be doing is not creating as many refugees.
You are 70, how many years?
72. 73 in March.
Cool.
Feels weird. Trust me, you'll never feel different mentally and emotionally than what you do now. Just your body will get in the fucking way.
Okay. But I'm not sure if we're going to continue growing older.
That's my problem. I don't think you're going to hit my age.
You think so?
That's what I worry about global warming and what's going to happen next.
No, I'm thinking that we're going to solve the aging problem.
That's areas of total speculation about what technologies we can produce in the future.
So you don't think this is...
I think it's possible. We know that what actually causes, one of the things that causes degradation over time is what are called telomerase. You know what telomerase is?
No.
It's a lump of proteins at the end of each DNA strand. And every time DNA breaks apart and replicates, some of the telomerase gets lost. So over time, each time you go through a reproduction cycle, you've got less and less and less of the telomerase at the end. And then finally, you'll break down and have old age and die. Okay, so partly the decay is just our DNA breaking down over time. We're also damaging ourselves by what we're consuming. So the amount of microplastics, all that is huge damage to ourselves. So we have to do two things. With
sauna, you can remove the plastic.
Sorry?
With sauna.
Like a hot sauna? Or
hot sauna. You can remove the plastics in your body.
Do you have regular saunas?
We have here in the European Parliament.
Do you go?
Yeah.
I've only been for a sauna 2
you
or 3.
You can work out here if you want today.
I should. Got to go back to my lectures tonight. But yeah, so we've got to stop damaging our bodies by the waste we dump in, and we've got to work out how to reverse that telomerase decay process. So it's potential. We imagine we could do it, but that's again we're so close to achieving so many things to liberate ourselves from the constraints of the planet. At the same time, we're destroying the planet. So my pessimism will get to destroy it before we manage to do the creation.
So,
but I think we're close. Yeah.
To solve the.
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, how you learn all this stuff that you know?
I'm a voracious reader, and I speed read without even knowing that I'm speed reading.
Okay.
So like my reading speed, I did a speed reading course when I was a young man. My mother dragged me along to this thing, and I was very skeptical about it. But I remember the guy asking my mother, who was a pianist, he said, do you read music? And she said, yes, I do. And he said, well, do you read the bass and the treble at the same time? She said, yes, I do. He said, well, that's a span about this big. So you can read that many words in a single glance. And I was, that makes sense to me. And it made sense to me as well, obviously. So I then decided to do the course, and they gave us a book of short stories. And they said, just read them at your own pace. And then when you're finished, we'll talk about, how we're going to increase your speed over time. So he said, read for half an hour. And then he said, okay, now you've all done that. Tell us, what you've learned. Okay. And said, no, okay, now you've done that. Now start on chapter 3. Excuse me. I said, I've already read 3. I'll read 4 then. I said, I've already read 4. He said, 5? I said, yeah. 6? Yeah. 7? 8? I'd read about 3 times as many words as anybody else had read. So I was a natural speed reader, read at about, 600, 700 words a minute. They got me up to 3,000. So I could read a book. I could read a book of like the entire line of text and 3 or 4 lines of text simultaneously. So that's a reading advantage that I've had.
So you could learn 3 times faster.
3 or 4 times faster, yeah.
Than other people.
Yeah, without knowing that I was special, okay? Like, I led a student revolt at Sydney University when I was an undergraduate student. And we revolt against the teaching of economics. There was all this neoclassical stuff was being pushed down our throats. And we had a bunch of staff themselves that realised there were flaws in the theory. And then I joined that, the staff fighting against mainstream economics. And we had a strike in 1973 where I didn't attend a lecture in any of my courses for 3 months, including the law course. So I got to the exams, and it was a course on criminal law. And there was a book on criminal law that was the reference. So I read it in a day, about that thick. And I memorised sufficiently of the information to pass the exam. Everybody's convinced I was going to fail, including me. So I got a shock. But I could read that quickly and absorb that quickly.
So you're saying basically this advantage that you had, it helped you read so many stuff, so many books.
Yeah.
So
and
that's how you got the knowledge. And you are so fucking old. All this
exactly.
All this combination
comes together. I mean, it's ridiculous. But like one thing about the 60s, and this is why I think students suffer so badly these days, the focus was on education. You didn't go to university to get a job. You get to university to get an education and learn. Now it's all about credentialism.
Yes.
The students are under huge pressure to get a credential so they can get a job. When I was doing my first year of university in 1971, the unemployment rate in Australia was below 1.5%. And that was like literally recording who's signed up to get the dole. That's how it was recorded, not all the fudging they do these days. So it was an incredibly low level of unemployment. You basically was thought you were guaranteed to get a job. You could do what you damn well liked, you'd still get employment. So my father challenged me over all the political activity, and I was saying, I'm not there to get a job, I'm there to get an education, and I wasn't worried. Then unemployment rose in 1974, rose from 1.5% in Australia to 5%. So the breakdown in employment began way back then. But when I was through uni, I wanted to read and learn whatever I could. So I read philosophers, I read non-orthodox economists. I wanted to do engineering and physics as my degrees. I had lousy school teachers on physics, so I didn't carry down that path, but I read physics, I read engineering. So I just had an eclectic range of interests. And I had time. And I don't think, but if you've got to work in 2 or 3 gig economy jobs and you're stressed out from that sort of situation, and you can play a video game to unwind. Students don't do the same level of reading that was common in my generation. So I've got a double advantage. I was lucky that I was a very fast reader, wide range of interests, and I had time. And I think these days, even though there's much more information out there and more knowledge in that sense to tap into, there isn't the leisure time to be able to do that. So that's where I've got that advantage.
Okay. Why do you accept the invitation to come here?
Sorry?
Why did you accept the invitation to come here?
Well, I got it, and you never know what's going to happen. A large part of my life is serendipity. Okay, you can never say in advance what's going to be a successful thing for you. I heard a bit about you, and you got the invite, and you would ask me why you invited me. But I thought, that sounds interesting, and he's an MEP as well, and I want to change policy in the European Union. So if I can meet this guy and he happens to be intelligent and I like him, then there's a potential to help you develop sensible policies over time. It's worth a risk. I think I did a good deal on that front. Okay.
Thank you for coming. Because in economics, as I told you, I'm not very knowledgeable. So this was very enlightening conversation. I'm sure for everyone watching, you are amazing. So thank you for your time, and we'll go to the last question.
Yep. Okay.
Before the last question, did you have fun? Did you have fun?
I had fun. It was good, fun conversation.
Okay. If you actually die in 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds.
From now, what you want your last words in this planet to be?
Humans have to become custodians of life and not destroyers of life. That's the lesson we have to learn. If we are truly the intelligent species on the planet, then our objective should be to maintain life indefinitely on the planet. That's what we should try to achieve. That'd be my final message.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for listening until the end. Guys, you are heroes.